Chapter 7 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup.
This is a LibriVox recording.
All
is in
LibriVox
the
recordings
are in the public domain.
On leaving the
For
New
more
Orleans
information or
slave
to
pen,
volunteer,
Harry
please
and I
visit
followed our new
LibriVox.org.
master through the streets, while
12 Years a
Eliza,
Slave
crying
by
and
Solomon
turning back,
Northup.
was
Chapter
forced
1.
along by Freeman and his minions
Having been born a
until we
freeman,
found
and
ourselves
for more
on
than
board the
30 years
steamboat
enjoyed the
Rodolph,
blessings of
then
liberty in a
lying
free
at the
state,
levee.
and
In
having
the
at the
course
end
of
of
half
that
an hour,
time been
we were
kidnapped
moving
and sold
briskly
into
up the
slavery,
Mississippi,
where I
bound for
remained
some
until
point on
happily
Red River.
rescued in the month
There were
of
quite a
January
number of slaves on board
1853,
beside
after a
ourselves,
bondage of 12
just
years.
purchased in the New
It has been
Orleans
suggested
market.
that an
I
account of
remember
my
a
life
Mr.
and
Kelso,
fortunes
who
would
was
not
said
be
to be a
uninteresting to the
well-known and
public.
extensive planter,
Since my
had
return
in
to
charge
liberty,
a gang of
I have
women.
not failed to perceive
Our
the
master's
increasing
name was William
interest throughout
Ford.
the northern
He
states
resided then
in
in the
regard to the
Great Pine
subject of
Woods,
slavery.
in the parish of
Works of
Avoyelles,
fiction
situated
professing
on the
to
right
portray
bank
its
of Red
features
River,
in their
in
more
the heart of
pleasing as well as
Louisiana.
more repugnant
He is now a
aspects have
Baptist
been
preacher.
circulated to an
Throughout
extent
the whole
unprecedented,
parish of Avoyelles,
and, as I
and
understand,
especially
have
along
created
both
a
shores
fruitful
of
topic
Bayou
of
Boeuf,
comment and
where
discussion.
he is more intimately
I can
known.
speak of
He is
slavery
accounted by
only
his
so
fellow
far as it came
citizens
under
as a
my
worthy
own
minister of
observation.
God.
Only
In
so
many
far
northern
as I have
minds,
known and
perhaps,
experienced
the
it in
idea
my
of a
own
man
person.
holding his brother
My
man in
object is
servitude
to give a
and the
candid and
traffic in
truthful
human
statement
flesh
of facts,
may seem
to
altogether
repeat the story of
incompatible
my
with their
life
conceptions
without
of a moral
exaggeration,
or religious
leaving it
life.
for others to
From
determine whether
descriptions of
even the
such men
pages of
as
fiction
Birch and
present a
Freeman
picture
and
of more
others
cruel
hereinafter
wrong
mentioned,
or a
they are
severer
led to
bondage.
despise and
As
execrate
far
the
back
whole
as I have
class
been
of
able to
slaveholders
ascertain, my
indiscriminately.
ancestors on the
But I
paternal
was
side
some
were
time his
slaves in
slave,
Rhode Island.
and had an
They
opportunity of
belonged to a
learning well
family
his
by the name
character
of
and
Northup,
disposition,
one of whom,
and it is
removing
but
to the
simple
state of
justice
New
to
York,
him when I say,
settled at
in my
Hoosier,
opinion,
in
there never
Rensselaer
was
County.
a more kind,
He brought with
noble,
him Mintus
candid,
Northup,
Christian
my
man
father.
than William
On the
Ford.
death of this gentleman,
The
which must
influences
have
and
occurred some
associations
50
that
years
had
ago,
always
my
surrounded
father
him
became free,
blinded him
having
to the
been
inherent wrong
emancipated
at the
by a
bottom of the
direction in his
system of
will.
slavery.
Henry B.
He never
Northup,
doubted the
Esquire,
moral
of Sandy
right of
Hill,
one
a
man holding
distinguished
another in
counsellor at
subjection.
law, and the man
Looking
to
through
whom,
the same
under
medium
Providence,
with his
I am
fathers
indebted
before
for
him,
my
he
present
saw
liberty,
things in the
and my
same light.
return to the society of
Brought
my wife
up
and
under
children
other
is a
circumstances
relative
and
of
other
the family in
influences,
which my
his
forefathers
notions would
were thus
undoubtedly
held to
have been
service,
different.
and from which they took the
Nevertheless,
name
he
I
was a
bear.
model master,
To this fact may
walking
be
uprightly
attributed the
according to the
persevering
light of his
interest he has
understanding.
taken in my
And
behalf.
fortunate was the slave who
Sometime
came to
after
his
my
possession.
father's liberation,
Were all
he
men
removed
such as
to the
he,
town of Minerva,
slavery would be
Essex
deprived
County,
of
New
more
York,
than half
where I
its
was born
bitterness.
in the month of July
We were 2 days
1808.
and 3 nights
How
on
long he
board the
remained in the
steamboat
latter
Rodolph,
place, I have not the
during which
means of
time
definitely
nothing of particular
ascertaining.
interest
From
occurred.
thence he removed
I
to
was now
Granville,
known
Washington
as Platt,
County,
the name
near a
given
place
me by
known as
Birch,
Slyborough,
and by which I
where
was
for some years
designated through
he
the whole
laboured on the
period of my
farm of
servitude.
Clark Northup,
Eliza was
also a
sold by the
relative of his
name of
old master.
Drady. She
From
was
thence
so
he
distinguished
removed to the
in the
Olden
conveyance
farm
to
at
Ford,
Moss Street,
now on
a short
record in the
distance north
recorder's
of the
office
village
in
of
New
Sandy
Orleans.
Hill, and from thence
On
to the
our
farm
passage,
now
I was
owned by
constantly
Russell
reflecting
Pratt,
on my situation
situated on the
and
road
consulting
leading
with
from Fort
myself
Edward
on the
to
best
Argyle,
course to
where
pursue
he
in
continued
order
to
to
reside
effect my
until his
ultimate
death,
escape.
which took place on the
Sometimes,
22nd
not
day of
only
November,
then, but afterwards, I
1829.
was almost on
He
the
left a
point
widow
of
and
disclosing
2
fully to
children,
Ford the
myself
facts of my
and
history.
Joseph, an
I am
elder brother.
inclined now to the
The latter
opinion
is still
it
living
would
in
have
the
resulted
county of
in my
Oswego,
benefit.
near the city
This
of that
course
name.
was often
My
considered,
mother died
but
during
through
the period
fear
of
of
my
its miscarriage,
captivity.
never put into
Though born a
execution,
slave
until
and
eventually
labouring
my
under the
transfer and
disadvantages
his
to which my
pecuniary
unfortunate
embarrassments
race is
rendered it
subjected,
evidently
my
unsafe.
father was a man respected
Afterwards,
for his
under other
industry and
masters,
integrity,
unlike William
as many
Ford,
now
I
living
knew
who
well
well
enough the
remember him
slightest
are ready
knowledge
to
of my
testify.
real character
His
would
whole
consign
life
me
was
at once
passed in
to
the
the
peaceful
remoter
pursuits
depths
of
of
agriculture,
slavery. I
never
was too
seeking
costly a
employment in
chattel
those
to be
more
lost,
menial
and was
positions
well aware
which
that I
seem to
would
be
be taken
especially
farther
allotted
on
to the
into
children of
some
Africa.
by-place, over the
Besides giving
Texan
us an
border
education
perhaps, and
surpassing
sold,
that
that I
ordinarily
would be
bestowed upon
disposed of
children
as
in
the
our
thief
condition,
disposes
he
of his
acquired
stolen
by his
horse,
diligence
if
and
my
economy
right to
a
freedom was
sufficient
even
property
whispered.
qualification
So I
to entitle
resolved
him
to
to the
lock the
right of
secret
suffrage.
closely in my
He was
heart,
accustomed accustomed to
never
speak
to
to us
utter
of his
one
early
word or
life,
syllable as
and
to
although
who
at
or
all
what I
times
was,
cherishing the
trusting
warmest
in
emotions
providence
of kindness
and my own
and
shrewdness
even of
for
affection
deliverance.
towards the family
At
in whose
length, we
house he
left
had
the
been a
steamboat
bondsman,
Rodolphe at
he
a place
nevertheless
called
comprehended
Alexandria,
the system of
700
slavery,
miles from
and
New
dwelt with
Orleans.
sorrow
It is
on
a
the
small town
degradation
on
of
the
his
southern
race.
shore of Red
He
River.
endeavoured to
Having
imbue our
remained there
minds with
overnight,
sentiments of
we
morality,
entered the morning
and to
train of
teach us to
cars
place
and
our
were
trust
soon
and
at
confidence
Bayou
in
La
him
Marie,
who
a
regards the
still smaller
humblest as
place,
well as the
distant
highest of
18
his
miles
creatures.
from Alexandria.
How often
At
since
that
that
time,
time
it was
has
the
the
termination
recollection
of
of
the
his
railroad.
paternal counsels
Ford's
occurred to me
plantation was
while lying in
situated
a
on the
slave hut
Texas
in the
Road,
distant and
12
sickly
miles from
regions
La
of
Marie,
Louisiana,
in the great
smarting with the undeserved wounds which an inhuman master had inflicted, and longing only for the grave which had covered him to shield me also from the lash of the oppressor. In the churchyard at Sandy Hill, an humble stone marks the spot where he reposes,
and the
after
bottoms
having
of our
worthily
feet were very
performed the
tender
duties
from the effects
appertaining
of the
to the lowly
smallpox.
sphere
We
wherein God had
proceeded
appointed
slowly,
him to walk.
Ford telling us to take our
Up to
time
this
and
period,
sit
I had
down
been
and rest
principally
whenever we
engaged with
desired,
my father in
a
the labours
privilege
of the
that was
farm.
taken advantage of
The leisure
quite
hours
frequently.
allowed me were generally
After
either
leaving
employed
Lamourie
over my
and
books
crossing two
or playing on the
plantations,
violin,
one
an
belonging to
amusement
Mr.
which was the
Carnell,
ruling
the
passion
other
of
to
my
a
youth.
Mr. Flint.
It has
We
also
reached
been the
the
source
pine
of
woods,
consolation
a wilderness
since,
that
affording
stretches to the
pleasure to the
Sabine
simple
River.
beings with whom my
The
lot
whole
was
country
cast,
about
and
Red
beguiling
River
my own
is low
thoughts
and
for
marshy.
many hours
The
in the
pine woods,
painful
as they are
contemplation
called,
of
is
my fate.
comparatively upland.
On
with
Christmas
frequent
Day,
small intervals,
1829,
however, running
I was
through them.
married to Anne
This
Hampton,
upland is
a
covered
coloured
with
girl
numerous
then
trees,
living in the
the
vicinity
white
of our
oak,
residence.
the chinkapin,
The ceremony was
resembling
performed
chestnut,
at Fort
but
Edward
principally
by
the yellow
Timothy
pine.
Eddy, Esquire,
They are of
a
great
magistrate
size,
of that town,
running up
and
60
still a
feet
prominent citizen
and
of the
perfectly
place.
straight.
She
The
had
woods were
resided
full
a
of
long
cattle,
time at
very
Sandy Hill
shy and
with
wild,
Mr. Baird,
dashing away in
proprietor
herds
of the
with
Eagle
a loud
Tavern,
snuff
and
at our
also
approach.
in the family of
Some
Reverend
of them
Alexander
were marked or
Proudfit
branded.
of Salem.
The rest appeared
This
to be in their
gentleman for
wild
many
and
years had
untamed state.
presided over the
They are much
Presbyterian
smaller than
Society
northern
at the
breeds,
latter
and the
place, and was
peculiarity
widely
about them that
distinguished
most
for his
attracted
learning
my
and
attention
piety.
was their horns.
Anne still
They stand
holds in
out from
grateful
the sides of the
remembrance
head
the
precisely
exceeding
straight,
kindness
like
and
two
the
iron
excellent
spikes.
counsels of that good
At
man.
noon, we reached a
She is
cleared
not
piece
able
of
to
ground
determine the
containing
exact
3 or
line of
4
her
acres.
descent, but the
Upon
blood
it
of
was a
3
small
races mingles
unpainted
in her
wooden
veins.
house, a
It is
corn crib,
difficult to
or,
tell
as we
whether
would
the
say,
red,
a barn,
white, or black
and a log
predominates.
kitchen,
The
standing
union of
about
them
a
all,
rod from
however,
the
in
house.
her origin,
It
has
was
given
the
her a
summer
singular
residence
but
of Mr.
pleasing
Martin.
expression, such
Rich
as is rarely
planters,
to be
having
seen.
large
Though
establishments
somewhat
on Bayou
resembling,
Boeuf,
yet she
are
cannot properly
accustomed
be
to
styled
spend the
a
warmer season
quadroon,
in
a
these
class
woods.
to which I have
Here they
omitted to
find
mention
clear water
my mother
and
belonged.
delightful shades.
I had
In
just
fact,
now passed
these
the period
retreats
of
are
my
to the
minority,
planters of that
having
section
reached
of the
the age
country
of 21
what
years in
Newport
the
and
month of July
Saratoga are
previous.
to the wealthier inhabitants
Deprived
of
of the
northern
advice and
cities.
assistance of my father,
We were sent
with a
around
wife
into the
dependent
kitchen
upon me for
and
support,
supplied with
I
sweet
resolved
potatoes,
to enter upon a
cornbread,
life of
and
industry,
bacon,
and
while Master
notwithstanding the
Ford
obstacle
dined
of
with
colour
Martin in
and
the
the
house.
consciousness of my
There were
lowly
several
state,
slaves about the
indulged in
premises.
pleasant dreams
Martin
of a good
came
time
out and
coming,
took a look at
when
us,
the possession
asking
of some
Ford
humble
the price of
habitation
each,
with a
if we were
few
green
surrounding
hands and so
acres
forth,
should reward
and
my
making
labours and
inquiries
bring
in
me the
relation to
means
the
of
slave
happiness
market
and
generally.
comfort. From the
After a
time of
long
my
rest, we
marriage to
set
this
forth
day,
again,
the love I
following
have
the
borne my
Texas
wife
road,
has been
which had the
sincere
appearance
and
of being
unabated,
very rarely
and only
travelled.
those who have felt the
For
glowing
5 miles
tenderness
we
a
passed
father
through
cherishes for his
continuous woods,
offspring can
without observing
appreciate
a
my
single
affection for
habitation.
the beloved
At
children
length,
which have
just
since
as the
been born
sun
to
was
us.
sinking in the west,
This
we
much I
entered
deem
another opening,
appropriate and necessary
containing
to
some
say,
12 or
in order
15
that
acres.
those who read these
In this
pages may
opening stood a
comprehend the
house much
poignancy
larger
of
than
those
Mr.
sufferings
Martin's.
I have been
It was
doomed
2
to bear.
stories high, with a
Immediately
piazza in
upon
front.
our marriage, we
In the
commenced
rear of it was
housekeeping
also a
in
log
the old
kitchen,
yellow
poultry
building
house,
then standing
corn
at the
cribs,
southern
and
extremity
several
of
Negro
Fort Edward
cabins.
village,
Near
and
the
which has
house was a
since
peach
been
orchard
transformed
and
into a
gardens
modern
of
mansion,
orange and
and
pomegranate
lately
trees.
occupied by
The
Captain
space was
Lathrop.
entirely
It is
surrounded
known
by
as the
woods
Fort House.
and covered with a
In this
carpet of
building,
rich,
the
rank
court was
verdure.
sometime held
It was a
after the
quiet,
organisation
lonely,
of the
pleasant
county.
place.
It was
Literally
also
a green
occupied
spot
by
in the
Burgoyne
wilderness.
in
It was the
1777,
residence of
being
my master,
situated near
William
the old
Ford.
fort on the left bank
As we
of the Hudson.
approached, a yellow
During the
girl,
winter,
her
I
name
was
was
employed
Rose,
with others
was
repairing
standing
the
on the
Champlain
piazza.
Canal,
Going
and
to
that
the door,
section over
she
which
called her
William
mistress,
Van
who
Nortwick was
presently came
superintendent.
running out to
David
meet her lord.
McEachran had the immediate
She kissed
charge
him
of the men
and
in whose
laughingly
company I
demanded
laboured.
if he had bought
By the time the
those
canal
niggers.
opened in the spring,
Ford said
I
he
was
had,
enabled,
and
from
told
the
us to
savings
go
of my
round to
wages,
Sally's
to
cabin
purchase a
and
pair
rest
of
ourselves.
horses and other
Turning the
things
corner of the
necessarily
house,
required
we
in the
discovered
business of
Sally
navigation.
washing. Her
Having
2
hired
baby
several
children near
efficient
her,
hands
rolling
to
on the
assist me,
grass.
I
They
entered
jumped
into
up and
contracts
toddled
for the
towards us,
transportation
looked
of
at us
large
a
rafts
moment
of
like a
timber
brace of
from
rabbits,
Lake Champlain
then
to
ran
Troy.
back to their mother as
Dyer
if afraid of
Beckwith
us.
and a Mr. Bartlemy of Sally conducted us into the cabin, told us to lay down our bundles and be seated, for she was sure that we were tired.
Art and mysteries
Just
of
then,
rafting,
John, the
a
cook,
knowledge which
a boy
afterwards
some
enabled me
16
to
years
render
of age
profitable
and
service
blacker
to a
than
worthy
any crow,
master,
came
and to
running
astonish
in,
the simple-witted
looked steadily
lumbermen
in our
on the
faces,
banks of the
then,
bayou
turning
Perth.
round,
In one
without
of my
saying as
voyages
much as
down
"How
Lake
do you do?"
Champlain, I
ran
was
back
induced
to the
to make a
kitchen,
visit to
laughing
Canada.
loudly, as if
Repairing
our
to
coming was
Montreal,
a great
I
joke
visited the
indeed.
cathedral and other places
Much
of
wearied
interest
with
in
our
that
walk,
city,
As
from
soon
whence
as it
I
was
continued
dark,
my
Harry and
excursion
I
to
wrapped our
Kingston
blankets
and other
round us
towns,
and laid
obtaining
down
a
upon
knowledge
the
of
cabin floor.
localities, which
My
was also of
thoughts,
service
as
to me
usual,
afterwards,
wandered
as will
back to my
appear
wife
towards the
and
close
children.
of this
The
narrative.
consciousness of my
Having
real
completed
situation,
my
the
contracts
hopelessness
on the
of
canal
any effort to
satisfactorily to
escape through the
myself and
wide
to my
forests of
employer,
Avoyelles,
and not wishing
pressed
to
heavily
remain
upon
idle,
me,
now that the
yet my
navigation
heart
of the
was at
canal was
home in
again
Saratoga.
suspended, I entered
I was
into another
awakened
contract
early in the
with
morning by the
Medad
voice
Gunn
of Master
to cut
Ford
a large
calling
quantity
Rose.
of wood.
She
In
hastened
this
into the
business,
house to
I was
dress the
engaged
children,
during the winter of
Sally to the field to
1831
milk
to
the cows,
32.
while John
With
was
the
busy
return
in the
of
kitchen
spring,
preparing
Anne
breakfast.
and myself
In the
conceived the
meantime,
project of
Harry and
taking
I
a
were
farm in
strolling
the
about the
neighbourhood.
yard,
I had
looking
been
at our new
accustomed
quarters.
from earliest youth
Just after
to
breakfast, a
agricultural
coloured
labours,
man
and it
driving
was an
3 yoke
occupation
of oxen
congenial to my
attached to a
tastes.
wagon load of
I
lumber
accordingly
drove
entered
into
into
the
arrangements for a
opening.
part
He
of
was
the
a slave
old
of
Olden
Ford's,
farm,
named
on which my
Walton,
father
the
formerly
husband
resided.
of Rose.
With
By the
one
way,
cow,
Rose
one
was a
swine,
native of
a yoke
Washington
of fine
and had been
oxen
brought
I had
from
lately
thence
purchased
5
of
years
Lewis
before.
Brown in Hartford,
She had never
and
seen
other personal
Eliza,
property
but
and
she had
effects.
heard of
We
Berry,
proceeded
and
to
they
our
knew
new
the
home
same
in
streets
Kingsbury.
and the same
That
people,
year, I
either
planted
personally
25
or by
acres of corn,
reputation.
sowed
They
large
became
fields of
fast
oats,
friends
and
immediately,
commenced
and
farming
talked
upon
a
as
great
large a
deal
scale
together
as
of
my
old
utmost
times
means
and
would
of
permit.
friends they had left
Anne
behind.
was diligent about the house
Ford
affairs,
was at that
while
time
I
a
toiled
wealthy man.
laboriously in the field.
Besides his seat in
On
the
this
Pine
place
Woods,
we
he
continued to
owned a
reside
large
until
lumbering establishment on
1834.
Indian Creek,
In the
4
winter
miles
season,
distant,
I had numerous
and
calls
also
to play
in
on
his
the
wife's
violin.
right,
Wherever
an
the young
extensive
people
plantation
assembled to
and many
dance,
slaves
I was
on
almost
Bayou Boeuf.
invariably there. Throughout
Walton
the
had come
surrounding
with his
villages,
load of
my
lumber
fiddle was
from the mills on
notorious.
Indian Creek.
Anne,
Ford
also,
directed us
during
to
her
return
long
with him,
residence at the
saying he
Eagle
would
Tavern,
follow us
had
as soon
become
as possible.
somewhat famous as a
Before
cook.
leaving, Mistress
During
Ford
court
called
weeks
me into
and
the
on public
storeroom and
occasions,
handed me,
she was
as it is there
employed at high
termed, a
wages
tin
in the
bucket
kitchen
of
at
molasses
Cheryl's
for
Coffee
Harry
House.
and myself.
We always returned
Eliza
home
was
from the
still wringing
performance
her
of these
hands and
services with
deploring
money
the
in
loss
our
of her
pockets,
children.
so that with
Ford
fiddling,
tried as much as
cooking, and
possible to
farming, we
console
soon
her,
found
told
ourselves in
her
the
she need
possession
not
of
work very
abundance,
hard,
and,
that
in
she might
fact,
remain with
leading a
Rose
happy and
and assist
prosperous
the
life.
madam in the house affairs.
Well, indeed, would it have
Riding
been for
with
us
Walton in
had
the
we
wagon,
remained on the
Harry and
farm
I
at
became
Kingsbury.
quite well
But
acquainted
the
with
time
him long
came
before
when the
reaching
next
Indian
step was
Creek.
to be taken
He
towards
was
the
a
cruel
born
destiny
thrall
that awaited
of
me.
Ford's, and
In
spoke
March
kindly and affectionately of
1834,
him,
we
as a
removed to
child would
Saratoga
speak of his
Springs.
own father.
We occupied
In
a
answer
house
to his
belonging to
inquiries
Daniel
from whence I
O'Brien
came,
on the north
I told
side
him
of
from
Washington
Washington.
Street.
Of
At
that
that
city
time,
he had
Isaac
heard
Taylor
much from
kept
his
a
wife
large boarding
Rose,
house
and
known
all
as
the way
Washington
plied me
Hall
with
at the
many
north end of
extravagant and
Broadway.
absurd
He
questions.
employed me to drive
On
a hack,
reaching the mills
in
at
which
Indian
capacity
Creek,
I worked
we
for him
found
2
2 more of
years.
Ford's slaves,
After this time,
Sam
I was
and
generally
Anthony.
employed through the
Sam
visiting
also
season,
was a
as also
Washingtonian,
was Anne,
having been
in the
brought
United
out in the
States
same gang
Hotel
with
and
Rose.
other public
He
houses
had
of the
worked on a
place.
farm near
In winter
Georgetown.
seasons, I relied
Anthony was a
upon my
blacksmith
violin,
from Kentucky,
though during
who
the
had been in
construction
his
of the
present
Troy and
master's service
Saratoga
about 10
Railroad,
years.
I performed many hard
Sam
days'
knew
labour
Birch,
upon it.
and when
I was in the
informed that
habit,
he
at
was the trader
Saratoga,
who had
of
sent me on from
purchasing
Washington,
articles
it was
necessary for my
remarkable
family
how
at the
well we
stores of
agreed
Mr.
upon the
Cephas
subject
Parker
of his
and Mr.
superlative
William Perry,
rascality.
gentlemen
He had
towards
forwarded
whom,
Sam
for
also.
many acts of kindness,
On Ford's
I
arrival at
entertained
the mill,
feelings of
we were
strong
employed
regard.
in
It
piling
was for
lumber
this reason
and
that,
chopping
12
logs,
years
which
afterwards,
occupation
I
we
caused to be
continued
directed
during
to
the
them the
remainder of the
letter,
summer.
which is hereafter
We usually
inserted,
spent
and
our
which was
Sabbaths
the
at the
means,
opening,
in the
on
hands
which
of Mr.
days our
Northup,
master would
of my
gather all his
fortunate
slaves about
deliverance.
him and
While
read and
living at the
expound the
United States
scriptures.
Hotel,
He
I
sought to
frequently met with
inculcate in our
slaves who
minds
had accompanied
feelings
their
of
masters
kindness
from the
towards each
south.
other, of
They were
dependence
always
upon
well
God,
dressed and well
setting
provided
forth
for,
the rewards
leading
promised
apparently
unto
an easy
those
life,
who lead an
with
upright
but
and
few of
prayerful
its
life.
ordinary troubles to
Seated in the
perplex them.
doorway of his house,
Many times
surrounded
they
by his
entered into
manservants
conversation
and
with
his
me on the
maidservants,
subject
who
of
looked
slavery.
earnestly into the
Almost
good man's face,
uniformly, I
he
found
spoke
they
of the
cherished
loving
a secret
kindness of the
desire for
Creator
liberty.
and of
Some
the
of them
life that is to
expressed
come.
the most ardent
Often did the
anxiety
the voice of prayer ascend from his lips to heaven, the only sound that broke the solitude of the place.
However, which they knew was certain to attend their recapture and return, in all cases
his mind
proved
dwelling
sufficient
intensely
to deter
on the
them
subject
from the
of
experiment.
religion. His
Having
mistress
all my
gave him a
life
Bible,
breathed the
which
free
he
air
carried
of the
with him
north,
to his work.
and conscious that I
Whatever
possessed
leisure
the
time
same
was allowed
feelings
him,
and
he
affections
spent in
that
perusing
find a
it,
place in the
though
white
it was
man's
only
breast,
with great difficulty
conscious,
that he could
moreover,
master any
of an
part of it.
intelligence equal to
I
that
often
of
read
some
to
men
him
at least,
a favour
with a
which he
fairer
well
skin.
repaid me by
I was
many
too
expressions
ignorant,
of gratitude.
perhaps too
Sam's
independent, to
piety was
conceive how
frequently
anyone
observed
could
by
be
white men
content to
who came
live
to the
in
mill,
the abject
and the
condition
remark it
of a
most
slave.
generally provoked
I could
was
not
that a
comprehend
man
the
like
justice
Ford,
of that
who
law
allowed his
or that
slaves to
religion
have Bibles,
which
was
upholds or
not fit
recognizes
to own
the
a nigger.
principle of slavery.
He,
And
however,
never once,
lost
I am
nothing
proud
by
to
his
say,
kindness.
did I fail to
It is a
counsel
fact I have
anyone
more
who
than
came
once
to me
observed
to watch his
that those who
opportunity
treated their
and strike
slaves
for
most
freedom.
leniently were rewarded by the greatest amount of labour. I know it from my own experience. It was a source of pleasure to surprise Master Ford with a greater day's work than was required
on the east
while,
side of the Hudson
under subsequent
had not
masters,
been realised.
there was no prompter to extra effort
comfortable
but the overseer's
circumstances,
lash.
we had not prospered.
It was the desire
The society
of Ford's
and
approving voice
associations at
that
that
suggested to
world-renowned
me an
watering
idea
place
that resulted
were not
to his
calculated
profit.
to preserve
The lumber
simple
we were
habits of
manufacturing was
industry
contracted
and
to be
economy
delivered
to which
at
I had
Lamoureux.
been accustomed.
It had hitherto
But,
been
on the
transported by
contrary,
land
to
and
substitute
was an
others
important
in their
item
stead,
of expense.
tending to
Indian
shiftlessness
Creek,
and
upon
extravagance.
which the mills were
At
situated,
this time,
was
we
a
were the
narrow
parents
but
of
deep
3
stream
children,
emptying into
Elizabeth,
Bayou Burf.
Margaret, and
In
Alonzo.
some places, it was
Elizabeth,
not more than
the
12
eldest,
feet wide
was in her
and
10th
much
year.
obstructed
Margaret
with trunks
was
of
2
trees.
years younger,
Bayou
and little
Burf was
Alonzo
connected
had
with
just
Bayou
passed his
Lamoureux.
5th birthday.
I
They
ascertained
filled
the
our
distance
house with
from the
gladness.
mills to the
Their
point
young
on the latter
voices were
bayou,
music
where
in
our
our
lumber
ears.
was to be delivered,
Many an
was
airy
but a
castle
few
did
miles
their
less
mother
by
and
land
myself
than
build
by
for the
water.
little innocents.
Provided
When
the
not
creek
at
could be
labour,
made
I was
navigable
always
for rafts,
walking with them,
it occurred to
clad
me
in
that
their
the
best
expense
attire
of
through the
transportation
streets
would be
and groves of
materially diminished.
Saratoga. Their presence
Adam
was my
Tatum,
delight,
a little
and
white
I
man who
clasped
had
them
been a
to my
soldier
bosom
in
with as
Florida
warm and
and had
tender
strolled
love
into
as
that
if their
distant
clouded
region,
skins
was
had been
foreman
as white
and
as snow.
superintendent of the mills.
Thus far,
He
the
scouted
history
the
of my
idea,
life
but
presents
Ford,
nothing
when I
whatever
laid it
unusual,
before him, received
nothing
it
but the common
favourably
hopes
and permitted
and
me
loves
to try
and
the
labours
experiment.
of an obscure
Having
coloured man
removed the
making
obstructions,
his humble
I made
progress
up a
in the
narrow
world.
raft
But
consisting
now I
of
had
12
reached a
cribs.
turning point in my
At this
existence,
business, I
reached
think I
the
was quite
threshold
skillful,
of
not
unutterable
having
wrong
forgotten my
and sorrow
experience years
and
before
despair.
on the Champlain Canal.
Now had I
I
approached
laboured
within the
hard,
shadow
being
of the cloud,
extremely anxious
into
to
the
succeed,
thick darkness
both
whereof
from a
I was
desire to
soon to
please my
disappear,
master and to
thenceforward
show
to be
Adam
hidden from
Tatum
the
that my
eyes of all
scheme
my
was not
kindred
such a
and
visionary
shut out
one
from
as
the
he
sweet light of
incessantly
liberty
pronounced it.
for many
One
a weary
hand
year.
could manage 3 cribs.
End of
I
chapter
took
1.
charge of the forward 3 and commenced poling down the creek. In due time we entered the first bayou, and finally reached our destination in a shorter period of time than I had anticipated.
12 Years a Slave
The arrival
by
of the
Solomon
raft at
Northup.
Lamoureux created a
This LibriVox
sensation,
recording is
while
in the
Mr.
public
Ford
domain.
loaded me with commendations.
One morning,
On all sides,
towards
I
the
heard
latter
Ford's
part of the
Platt
month of
pronounced
March
the smartest
1841,
nigger in the pine
having
woods.
at that time
In
no
fact,
particular
I was the
business to
Fulton
engage
of
my
Indian
attention,
Creek.
I was
not
walking about the
insensible
village
to
of
the praise
Saratoga
bestowed
Springs,
upon me,
thinking
and
to myself
enjoyed
where I might
especially
obtain
my
some
triumph
present
over
employment
Tatum,
until
whose
the busy
half
season
malicious
should
ridicule
arrive.
had stung my
Anne,
pride.
as was her
From this
usual
time,
custom,
the
had
entire
gone over
control
to
of
Sandy
bringing
Hill,
the lumber
a
to
distance
Lamoureux
of some
was
20
placed in my
miles,
hands
to take
until the
charge of the
contract was
culinary
fulfilled.
department at Sherrill's
Indian
Coffee
Creek,
House
in its
during
whole
the
length,
session of the
follows
court.
through a magnificent
Elizabeth,
forest.
I think, had
There
accompanied her.
dwells on its shore
Margaret
a tribe
and
of
Alonzo
Indians,
were with
a
their
remnant
aunt
of the
at
Chickasaws
Saratoga.
or Chickapees,
On the
if I
corner of
remember
Congress
rightly.
Street and
They
Broadway,
live in simple
near the
huts,
tavern,
10 or
then,
12
and
feet
for aught
square,
I know to the
constructed
contrary,
of
still
pine
kept
poles
by
and
Mr.
covered
Moon,
with bark.
I was met by
They
2
subsist
gentlemen of
principally on
respectable
the flesh of
appearance,
the deer,
both of
the
whom
coon,
were entirely
and
unknown to
opossum,
me.
all
I
of
have
which
the
are
impression
plenty in
that
these
they were
woods.
introduced to me by
Sometimes
someone
they
of my
exchange venison
acquaintances,
for a little
but
corn
who
and
I
whiskey
have in
with
vain
the planters
endeavoured to
on the
recall,
bayous.
with the
Their
remark that
usual
I was an
dress is
expert
buckskin
player on the
breeches
violin.
and calico
At
hunting
any rate,
shirts of
they
fantastic
immediately
colours,
entered into
buttoned from
conversation
belt
on
to
that
chin.
subject,
They
making
wear
numerous
brass rings on
inquiries
their wrists
touching my
and in
proficiency
their
in
ears
that
and
respect.
noses. The dress of the
My
squaws is
responses
very
being to
similar.
all
They are
appearances
fond of
satisfactory,
dogs and
they
horses,
proposed to
owning
engage
many
my
of the latter,
services for a
of a
short
small,
period,
tough breed,
stating at the
and are
same
skillful
time
riders.
I was just
Their
such a
bridles,
person as their
girths,
business
and
required.
saddles were made
Their
of raw
names,
skins
as
of
they
animals.
afterwards gave them
Their
to me,
stirrups
were
of a certain
Merrill
kind
Brown
of wood.
and Abram Hamilton.
Mounted
Though
astride
whether
their
these
ponies,
were their true
men and women,
appellations,
I
I
have
have
seen
strong
them
reasons
dash
to
out
doubt.
into the woods at the
The
utmost
former
of their
was a man
speed,
apparently
following
40
narrow,
years of
winding
age,
paths,
somewhat
and dodging
short and
trees in a
thick-set,
manner that
with a
eclipsed the
countenance
most miraculous feats of
indicating shrewdness and
civilized
intelligence.
equestrianism.
He wore a
Circling
black
away
frock
in
coat
various
and black
directions,
hat,
the
and
forest
said he
echoing and
resided either at
re-echoing with their
Rochester
whoops,
or
they
at
would presently
Syracuse.
return at the
The
same
latter was a
dashing,
young man
headlong
of
speed
fair
with which they
complexion
started.
and light eyes,
Their village was on
and, I
Indian
should
Creek,
judge, had
known
not
as
passed
Indian
the age
Castle,
of 25.
but their range
He was
extended
tall
to the
and
Sabine river.
dressed in a
Occasionally, a tribe from Texas would come over on a visit, and then there was indeed a carnival in the Great Pine Woods.
Was in the extreme
Chief of the tribe was Cascalla, second in rank, John Baltese, his son-in-law,
and there was about
with both of whom, as with many others of the tribe, I became acquainted during my frequent voyages down the creek with rafts.
Circus company.
Sam and myself would often visit them when the day's task was done.
Way thither to
they were
rejoin
obedient
it,
to the
having
chief.
left it for a
The
short
word
time
of
to make an
Cascalla was their
excursion
law.
northward.
They were a rude but harmless people and enjoyed their wild
by an
mode of
occasional
life.
exhibition.
They had little fancy for the open country,
that they had
the
found
cleared
much
lands on the
difficulty
shores of the
in
bayous,
procuring
but
music for their
preferred to hide
entertainments,
themselves within the
and that
shadows
if I
of
would
the
accompany
forest.
them as
They
far as New
worshipped the
York,
Great
they
Spirit,
would give me
loved
$1
whiskey,
for each
and
day's
were happy.
services, and
On
$3
one
in
occasion, I
addition
was
for
present at
every
a
night
dance
I
when
played
a
at their
roving herd from
performances,
Texas had
besides
encamped in their
sufficient
village.
to pay the
The entire
expenses of my
carcass of a
return
deer
from
was
New
roasting
York to
before a large
Saratoga.
fire,
I
which
at
threw
once
its light a
accepted
long
the
distance
tempting
among
offer,
the trees
both
under
for the
which they were
reward it
assembled.
promised and
When
from
they
a
had
desire
formed
to
in a
visit
ring,
the metropolis.
men and
They
squaws
were anxious
alternately,
to leave
a sort of
immediately.
Indian fiddle
Thinking my
set up an
absence would be
indescribable
brief,
tune.
I did not
It
deem
was
it
a
necessary
continuous,
to write to
melancholy
Al
kind
whither I
of
had gone.
wavy sound,
In fact,
with the
supposing that
slightest
my
possible
return
variation.
perhaps would be
At
as
the
soon as
first note,
hers.
if indeed
So,
there was
taking
more
a
than one
change of
note in the
linen
whole
and my
tune,
violin,
they
I
circled
was ready
around,
to depart.
trotting after each
The
other
carriage was
and
brought
giving
round,
utterance to
a
a
covered
guttural,
one,
sing-song
drawn by
noise,
a pair of
equally as
noble bays,
nondescript as the music of the
altogether
fiddle.
forming an
At the
elegant
end of the
establishment.
third circuit, they would
Their
stop suddenly,
baggage,
whoop as
consisting
if
of
their
3
lungs would
large
crack,
trunks,
then
was
break from
fastened
the
on
ring,
the rack,
forming in
and
couples,
mounting to the
man and
driver's
squaw,
seat,
each
while they
jumping
took their
backwards as
places
far
in
as
the
possible
rear,
from the
I
other,
drove away
then
from
forwards,
Saratoga
each
on the
jumping
road to
backwards
Albany,
as far as
elated
possible
with my
from
new
the other,
position,
then
and happy
forwards,
as I had ever
which
been
graceful
on any
feat
day
having been
in all my
twice or
life.
thrice accomplished,
We
they
passed
would
through
form in a
Ballston,
ring and go trotting
striking the
round
Ridge
again.
Road, as it is
The
called,
best
if my
dancer
memory
appeared to be
correctly serves
considered the
me,
one who could
followed
whoop
it
the
direct
loudest,
to Albany.
jump the
We
farthest,
reached
and
that
utter
city
the most
before dark,
excruciating
and
noise.
stopped at a hotel
At intervals,
southward from
one
the
or more
museum.
would leave the dancing
This night
circle,
I had an
and going to
opportunity
the
of
fire,
witnessing one
cut
of their
from the roasting
performances,
carcass a
the
slice
only
of
one
venison.
during the whole
In a
period
hole
I was with them.
shaped like a mortar,
Hamilton was
cut in the
stationed
trunk
at the
of a
door.
fallen tree,
I
they
formed
pounded
the
corn
orchestra,
with a wooden
while
pestle,
Brown
and
provided
of the
the
meal made
entertainment.
cake.
It consisted
Alternately,
in
they
throwing
danced and
balls,
ate.
dancing on
Thus
the
were the
rope,
visitors from
frying
Texas
pancakes in a
entertained by
hat,
the dusky sons
causing
and
invisible
daughters of the
pigs to
Chickapees,
squeal,
and such
and
is a
other like
description, as I
feats
saw
of
it, of an
ventriloquism
Indian
and
ball in the
legerdemain.
pine woods of
The audience
Avoyelles.
was extraordinarily
In the autumn,
sparse,
I left
and
the
not of the
mills and
selectest
was
character
employed
at
at the
that.
opening.
And
One
Hamilton's
day, the
report of the
mistress was
proceeds
urging Ford
presented
to
but
procure
a
a loom
beggarly
in order
account
that
of
Sally
empty
might
boxes.
commence weaving cloth
Early
for the
next
winter
morning,
garments
we
of the
renewed our
slaves.
journey.
He
The
could not
burden of
imagine
their
where one was to
conversation
be
now
found,
was the
when I
expression of an
suggested that the
anxiety to
easiest
reach
way
the
to get
circus
one
without
would
delay.
be to make it,
They hurried
informing
forward
him at the
without
same
again
time
stopping
that I
to
was a
exhibit.
sort of jack
And
of
in
all
due course of
trades,
time,
and
we
would
reached
attempt
New
it
York,
with his
taking
permission.
lodgings
It
at a
was
house
granted
on the
very
west
readily,
side of the
and
city,
I was
in
allowed
a
to go
street
to a
running from
neighbouring
Broadway
planter's
to
to
the river.
inspect one before
I
commencing the
supposed my
undertaking.
journey was at an
At
end,
length
and
it was
expected
finished,
in a day
and
or two at
pronounced by
least to
Sally to
return
be
to my
perfect.
friends and
She
family
could
at
easily
Saratoga.
leave her task
Brown
of
and
14
Hamilton,
yards,
however,
milk
began
the
to
cows,
importune me
and
to
have leisure
continue with
time
them to
besides
Washington.
each day.
They alleged
It
that
worked so
immediately
well,
on their
I was
arrival,
continued in the
now that the
employment
summer
of making
season was
looms,
approaching,
which were
the
taken
circus
down to
would
the
set out for
plantation
the
on the
north.
bayou.
They promised me a
At this
situation
time,
and
one
high
John
wages
M.
if I
Tibbets,
would
a
accompany them.
carpenter, came to
Largely
the
did they
opening to do some
expatiate on
work
the
on Master's
advantages that
house.
would result to me,
I was
and
directed to
such were
quit
the
the looms
flattering
and assist him.
representations they
For
made
2
that I
weeks I
finally
was in his
concluded
company,
to accept the
planing
offer.
and matching
The
boards for
next
ceiling,
morning, they
a plastered
suggested
room
that,
being a rare
inasmuch as
thing
we
in the
were about
parish of
entering a
Avoyelles.
slave state, it would
John
be as
M.
well,
Tibbets
before
was the
leaving New
opposite of
York,
Ford
to
in all
procure
respects.
free papers.
He was a
The
small,
idea struck
crabbed,
me as a prudent one,
quick-tempered,
though
spiteful
I
man.
think it would
He
scarcely
had
have
no
occurred to
fixed
me
residence
had
that
they
I
not
ever heard
proposed
of,
it.
but
We
passed
proceeded
from one
at once to
plantation
what
to
I
another
understood to be
wherever
the
he could
custom
find
house.
employment.
They made
He
oath
was
to
without
certain
standing in the
facts,
community,
showing I was a
not
free
esteemed
man.
by white
A
men,
paper was
nor
drawn
even
up
respected
and
by
handed us
slaves.
with the direction
He
to
was
take it to
ignorant
the clerk's
withal,
office.
and of a
We
revengeful
did
disposition.
so, and the clerk
He
having
left the
added
parish
something
long
to it,
before
for
I
which
did,
he was
and I
paid
know
6
not
shillings,
whether he is at
we
present
returned
alive
again
or
to the
dead.
custom house.
Certain it
Some
is,
further
it was a most
formalities were
unlucky
gone
day for
through
me
with
that brought us
before it was
together.
completed,
During my
when,
residence with
paying the
Master
officer
Ford,
$2
I had seen only the bright side of slavery.
And
His
started
was
with
no
my
heavy
two
hand
friends
crushing
to our
us to the
hotel.
earth.
I
He
thought
pointed
at the time,
upwards,
I must
and with
confess,
benign and
that the
cheering
papers were
words
scarcely
addressed us
worth
as
the
his
cost
fellow
of obtaining
mortals,
them. The
accountable,
apprehension
like
of
himself,
danger to my
the
personal
maker of us
safety
all.
never having
I think of
suggested
him with
itself to me
affection,
in the remotest
and had
manner.
my family been with me,
The clerk,
could have
to
borne
whom
his
we were
gentle
directed,
servitude
I remember,
without
made a
murmuring all
memorandum
my
in a
days.
large book, which,
But
I
clouds
presume,
were
is
gathering
in
in
the
the
office
horizon,
yet. A
forerunners of a
reference to the
pitiless
entries
storm that
during
was
the
soon
latter
to break
part of
over me.
March,
I
or
was doomed
1st of
to
April,
endure such bitter
1841,
trials as
I
the
have
poor
no
slave
doubt will
only knows,
satisfy the
and to lead
incredulous,
no
at
more the
least as far as
comparatively
this
happy
particular
life which I
transaction
had
is
led
concerned.
in the great pine
With
woods.
the evidence of freedom
End
in my
of chapter
possession,
7.
the next day after our arrival in New York, we crossed the ferry to Jersey City and took the road to Philadelphia. Here we remained one night,
continuing our journey towards Baltimore early in the morning.
Of 12 Years a Slave by
we
Solomon
arrived in the
Northup.
latter city,
This
and
LibriVox
stopped at a
recording
hotel
is in
near
the
the
public
railroad
domain.
depot, either kept
William
by
Ford
a Mr.
unfortunately
Rathbone,
became
or
embarrassed
known
in
as
his
the Rathbone
pecuniary
House.
affairs.
All
A
the
heavy
way from New
judgment was
York,
rendered
their
against him in
anxiety to
consequence
reach the
of his
circus
having become
seemed to grow
security for his
more and
brother,
more intense.
Franklin Ford,
We left the
residing on
carriage
Red
at
River
Baltimore,
above
and
Alexandria,
entering the cars,
and who had
proceeded
failed
to
to meet
Washington,
his liabilities.
at which place
He
we
was
arrived
also
just at
indebted to
nightfall,
John M.
the
Tibbets
evening
to a
previous to the
considerable
funeral
amount
of
in
General
consideration
Harrison,
of his
and
services
stopped
in
at
building the
Gadsby's
mills on
Hotel
Indian
on
Creek,
Pennsylvania
and
Avenue.
also a weaving house,
After supper,
corn
they
mill,
called
and
me to
other
their
erections
apartments
on the
and
plantation
paid
at
me
Bayou Burr,
$43,
not yet
a
completed.
sum greater than
It
my
was
wages
therefore
amounted
necessary,
to,
in order
which
to meet
act
these
of
demands,
generosity
to
was in
dispose of
consequence,
18
they
slaves,
said, of
myself
their not
among the
having
number.
exhibited as often
17
as
of
they
them,
had given me to
including Sam and
anticipate
Harry,
during our
were
trip from
purchased by
Saratoga.
Peter Compton,
They
a planter
moreover
also
informed
residing
me
on Red
that
River.
it had been the intention of the
I was
circus
sold
company
to Tibbets
to leave
in
Washington the next
consequence,
morning,
undoubtedly, of
but
my
that,
slight
on
skill
account
as
of
a
the funeral,
carpenter.
they had
This was in the
concluded to
winter
remain
of
another day.
1842.
They
The
were
deed
then,
of
as they
myself
had been
from
from the
Freeman
time
to
of our
Ford,
first
as I
meeting,
ascertained from
extremely
the public
kind.
records in
No
New Orleans on my
opportunity was
return,
omitted
was
of
dated
addressing me
June
in the language
23rd,
of approbation,
1841.
while, on the
At the
other
time
hand,
of my
I
sale
was
to
certainly
Tibbets,
much
the price
prepossessed
agreed to
in
be
their
given
favour.
for me being
I
more than
gave
the
them my
debt.
confidence
Ford
without
took
reserve,
a chattel
and
mortgage
would
of
freely have
$400.
trusted them to almost
I am
any
indebted
extent.
for my life,
Their
as will
constant
hereafter be
conversation
seen,
and
to
manner
that
towards
mortgage.
me, their foresight
I
in
bade
suggesting
farewell
the
to my
idea
good
of free
friends at the
papers,
opening,
and 100 other
departed with
little
my new
acts,
master Tibbets.
unnecessary to be
We
repeated,
went down
all
to the plantation
indicated
on
that they
Bayou
were
Burr,
friends indeed,
distant 27
sincerely
miles from the
solicitous
pine
for
woods,
my welfare.
to complete the
I know
unfinished
not
contract.
that they were. I
Bayou
know
Burr
not
is a
that they were
sluggish,
innocent of
winding
the great
stream,
wickedness
one of
of
those
which I now
stagnant
believe
bodies
them
of
guilty.
water common in that
Whether
region,
they were accessory
setting
to
back
my
from Red River.
misfortunes,
It stretches
subtle
from
and
a point
inhuman
not far
monsters
from
in the shape
Alexandria,
of men,
in a southeasterly
designedly
direction,
luring me away
and
from
following
home
its
and
tortuous
family
course
and
is
liberty
more than
for
50
the
miles
sake
in
of
length.
gold. Those who
Large
read
cotton
these
and sugar
pages will have
plantations
the
line
same
each
means
shore,
of determining,
extending
as
back to the
myself,
borders of
if they were
interminable
innocent.
swamps.
My sudden
It is alive with
disappearance must have
alligators,
been
rendering
unaccountable
it unsafe
indeed.
for swine, or
But,
unthinking
revolving
slave
in my
children
mind
to
all the
stroll along
attending
its banks.
circumstances, I
Upon a
never
bend
yet
in this
could
bayou,
indulge
a short
towards
distance
them
from
so charitable
Cheneyville,
a
was
supposition.
situated the plantation
After
of Madame
receiving the
Ford.
money from them,
Her brother,
of which
Peter
they
Tanner,
appeared to
a
have an
great
abundance,
landholder,
they
living
advised
on
me
the
not
opposite
to go
side.
into the streets that
On my
night,
arrival at
inasmuch
Bayou
as I was
Burr, I
unacquainted
had the
with the
pleasure of
customs
meeting
of the
Eliza,
city.
whom I had
Promising
not
to
seen for
remember their
several
advice,
months.
I left
She had
them
not
together,
pleased Mrs.
and
Ford,
soon after
being
was
more
shown by a
occupied in
coloured
brooding
servant
over her
to a sleeping
sorrows than
room
in
in the back
attending to
part
her
of the
business,
hotel,
and
on the
had,
ground
in
floor.
consequence,
I
been
laid
sent
down to rest,
work in the field
thinking
on the
of home
plantation.
and wife
She had
and
grown
children,
feeble and
the long
emaciated,
distance that
and was
stretched
still
between
mourning
us
for her children.
until I fell asleep.
She asked me
But
if I
no
had
good
forgotten them,
angel of
and a
pity
great
came
many
to my
times
bedside,
inquired if I
bidding
still
me to
remembered
fly.
how handsome
No
little
voice
Emily
of
was,
mercy
how much
forewarned me
Randall
in my
loved her,
dreams
and
of the
wondered if
trials
they were
that
living
were just
still,
at hand.
and where the
The
darlings could
next
then
day
be.
there was a
She
great
had sunk
pageant in
beneath
Washington.
the weight of an
The
excessive
roar
grief.
of cannon and the
Her
tolling
drooping
of
form
bells
and
filled
hollow
the
cheeks
air,
too
while
plainly
many houses
indicated
were
that she had
shrouded
well
with
nigh
crape and
reached
the
the end
streets
of
were
her
black
weary
with
road.
people. As the day
Ford's
advanced, the
overseer on this
procession made its
plantation,
appearance,
and who had
coming
the
slowly
exclusive
through the
charge of
avenue,
it, was a
carriage
Mr.
after
Chapin,
carriage
a
in
kindly
long
disposed
succession,
man
while
and a native
thousands
of
upon
Pennsylvania.
thousands followed on
In
foot,
common with others,
all moving
he
to
held
the sound
Tibbets
of
in light
melancholy
estimation,
music.
which
They were
fact, in
bearing the dead
connection with the
body of Harrison
$400
to the
mortgage,
grave.
was fortunate
From
for me.
early in the morning, I
was
was
now
constantly
compelled
in the
to labour
company of
very
Hamilton
hard.
and Brown.
From earliest
They were the
dawn
only
until late
persons
at
I
night,
knew in
I
Washington.
was not allowed to
We
be a
stood
moment
together
idle.
as the funeral pomp
Notwithstanding
passed
which,
by.
Tibbets was
I
never
remember
satisfied.
distinctly
He
how
was
the window
continually
glass would
cursing
break
and
and rattle
complaining.
to the ground
He never
after
spoke to
each
me a kind
report of the
word.
cannon they were
I was
firing in
his
the burial
faithful
ground.
slave, and
We
earned
went
him
to the
large
Capitol
wages every
and
day,
walked a long
and yet
time
I
about
went
the
to my
grounds.
cabin nightly,
In the afternoon,
loaded with
they
abuse
strolled
and stinging
towards the
epithets.
President's house,
We
all
had
the time
completed the
keeping me
corn
near
mill,
to them,
the kitchen
fiction, and so forth, and were at work upon the weaving house. As yet, when I was guilty of an act, in that state punishable with death. I had thought of it but little. It was my first fight with Tibby. The excitement of the day. The weaving house we were erecting several times during the afternoon, a few rods from the residence of Chapin, and called for liquor. The Great House, they were by no means in the habit, however, one night, so far as I knew them, it was too dark to see. I was ordered by Tibby to rise very early in the morning, They would pour out a keg of nails and hand it to me, and I did not become intoxicated, as may be inferred from what subsequently occurred,
and having cooked a
towards
supper of
evening,
bacon and
and
corn
soon
cake,
after
and
partaking of
conversed
one
a
of
while
these
with
potations,
who
I began
occupied
to
the same
experience
cabin,
most
as
unpleasant
also did
sensations.
Lawson and his wife
I
Mary,
felt extremely
and a slave
ill.
named Bristol,
My head commenced
laid down
aching,
upon the
a
ground
dull,
floor,
heavy
little
pain,
dreaming of the sufferings that awaited me
disagreeable.
on the morrow.
At the supper table,
Before
I was
daylight,
without
I was
appetite.
on the piazza
The
of the
sight and
great
flavour
house,
of food was
awaiting the
nauseous.
appearance of
About
overseer
dark,
Chapin.
the same servant
To have aroused
conducted
him
me
from
to
his
the room
slumbers
I had
and
occupied
stated my
the
errand
previous night.
would have been an
Brown and
unpardonable
Hamilton
boldness.
advised me to
At length,
retire,
he came out.
commiserating me kindly,
Taking off my hat,
and expressing
I informed
hopes
him
that I
Master
would be
Tibeats
better
had
in the
directed
morning.
me to call upon him
Divesting
for a keg
myself
of nails.
coat and boots
Going
merely,
into the storeroom,
I threw
he
myself
rolled it out,
upon the bed.
at the same time saying
It was
if
impossible
Tibeats
to
preferred
sleep.
a different
The
size,
pain in
he would
my head
endeavour to furnish
continued
them,
to increase
but that I might
until it
use
became
those until
almost
further
unbearable.
directed. Then
In a
mounting
short
his
time,
horse,
I became
which stood
thirsty.
saddled and bridled
My
at the
lips were
door,
parched.
he rode away
I could
into
think
the
of
field,
nothing but
whither the
water,
slaves had
of
preceded him,
lakes and flowing
while I
rivers,
took the keg
of
on my
brooks
shoulder and
where I had
proceeded to the
stooped
weaving
drink,
house,
and
broke
of
in
the
the head,
dripping bucket
and commenced
rising
nailing
with
on the
its cool
clapboards.
and overflowing nectar
As the day
from the
began to
bottom
open,
of the well.
Tibeats came out of the
Towards
house to
midnight,
where I was,
as near as
hard
I
at
could
work.
judge, I
He
arose,
seemed to be that
unable
morning
longer
even
to
more
bear such
morose and
intensity of
disagreeable than
thirst.
usual.
I was a
He was my
stranger in
master,
the house, and
entitled
knew
by
nothing
law
of
to
its
my flesh and
apartments.
blood,
There was
and
no
to
one
exercise
up, as
over
I
me
could
such
observe.
tyrannical
Groping
control
about
as
at
his mean
random,
nature
I knew
prompted.
not where,
But
I
there was
found
no
the way
law
at
that
last
could
to a
prevent my
kitchen in
looking
the
upon him
basement.
with intense
2 or
contempt.
3 coloured
I
servants were
despised both
moving
his
through
disposition
it, one of whom,
and his
a woman,
intellect.
gave me 2
I had
glasses
just
of
come
water.
round to the keg for a
It
further supply
afforded
of nails
momentary
as
relief,
he reached the
but
weaving
by the
house.
time I had reached my
I
room
thought I
again,
told you to
the
commence
same
putting
burning
on
desire of
weatherboards
drink,
this morning,
the
he
same
remarked.
tormenting thirst
Yes, master,
had
and
again
I am
returned.
about it, I replied.
It was even more
Where?
torturing
He
than
demanded.
before,
On
as
the other
was
side
also
was
the
my
wild
answer.
pain in
He
my
walked
head,
round to
if
the
such
other
a thing
side,
could be.
examined my
I
work
was in
for a
sore
while,
distress,
muttering to
in
himself
most
in a fault-finding
excruciating
tone.
agony.
Didn't I
seemed
tell
to
you
stand
last
on the
night to get
brink
a
of
keg of
madness.
nails of Chapin?
The memory
He
of
broke
that
forth
night
again.
of horrible suffering
Yes, master,
will follow
and so
me
I
to
did.
the grave.
And overseer
In the
said he would
course
get
of an
another
hour
size
or
for
more
you
after
if
my
you wanted
return
them
from the
when he
kitchen,
came back from
I
the
was
field.
conscious of someone
Tibeats
entering my
walked to the
room.
keg,
There
looked a
seemed to
moment
be
at the
several,
contents,
a
then
mingling
kicked
of
it
various
violently.
voices.
Coming
But
towards
how
me
many,
in a
or
great
who
passion,
they were,
he
I cannot
exclaimed,
tell.
"God damn
Whether
you,
Brown
I
and
thought
Hamilton
you know
were among
something.
them is
I
a
made
mere matter
answer.
of conjecture.
I tried to do as
I
you
only
told me,
remember,
master.
with
I
any
didn't
degree
mean
of
anything wrong.
distinctness, that I
Overseer
was
said,
told it was
but
necessary
he interrupted
to go
me
to a
with such
physician
a flood
and
of
procure
curses
medicine.
that I was unable to
And
finish the
thus pulling
sentence.
on my boots,
At
without
length,
coat
he
or
ran
hat,
towards the
I
house,
followed them
and
through
going
a
to the
long
piazza,
passageway
took
or
down
alley
one of the
into
overseer's
the long
whips.
street.
The whip
It
had a
ran out
short
at
wooden
right
stock,
angles from
braided over
Pennsylvania
with
Avenue.
leather,
On
and
the
was
opposite
loaded
side,
at the butt.
there was a light
The lash
burning
was
in a window.
3 feet long,
My
or thereabouts,
impression is
and
there
made
were
of
then 3
rawhide
persons
strands.
with me, but
At
it is
first I
altogether
was somewhat
indefinite
frightened,
and
and my
vague,
impulse was
and
to
like the
run.
memory of
There
a
was
painful
no one
dream.
about except
Going
Rachel,
towards
the
the
cook,
light,
and
which I
Chapin's
imagined
wife,
proceeded
and
from a
neither of them were to be
physician's
seen.
office,
The
and which
rest were in
seemed
the
to
field.
recede as I advanced,
I knew he
is
intended
the
to
last
whip me,
glimmering
and it was the
recollection
first
I can
time
now
anyone
recall.
had attempted it
From
since
that
my
moment,
arrival at
I was
Avoyelles.
insensible.
I
How
felt,
long
moreover,
I remained in
that
that
I had been
condition,
faithful,
whether
that I was
only
guilty
that
of
night,
no wrong
or
whatever,
many days and
and
nights,
deserved
I
commendation
do not know.
rather than punishment.
But when
My
consciousness
fear
returned,
changed to
I
anger,
found myself
and before
alone,
he reached me,
in
I
utter
had made up
darkness
my mind
and in
fully not
chains.
to be whipped.
The
Let the
pain in
result
my
be
head
life
had
or death.
subsided in a measure, but I was
Winding the
very
lash
faint
around
and
his
weak.
hand, and taking
I was
hold
sitting
of the
upon a
small
low
end of the
bench,
stock, he
made of
walked up
rough
to me,
boards,
and with a
and
malignant
without
look
coat or hat.
ordered me to strip.
I was handcuffed.
Master Tibeats,
Around my
said
ankles
I, looking
also
him boldly
were a pair
in the
of heavy
face.
fetters.
I will not.
One end of a chain
I was about to say
fastened to a
something
large
further
ring
in
the floor,
justification,
the
but
other
with
to the fetters on
concentrated
my
vengeance
ankles.
he sprang
I
upon
tried
me,
in vain
seizing
to
me by the
stand
throat
upon
with
my
one
feet.
hand, raising
Waking
the
from
whip with
such
the
a
other
painful
in the
trance,
act of striking.
It was some time before I
Before
could
the blow
collect my
descended,
thoughts.
however, I had
Where
caught
was him by the collar of the coat and drawn him closely to me. Where were Brown and Hamilton? Reaching down, I seized him by the ankle to deserve and pushing him back with the other hand, he fell over on the ground. Putting one arm around his leg and holding it to my breast so that his head and shoulders only touched the ground, I placed my foot upon his neck. He was completely in my power. I listened intently for some sign or sound of life, veins like but fire. Nothing broke the oppressive silence of my madness, save the clinking of the whip from his hand. Whenever I struggled with all his power. I spoke aloud that I should not live to see another day, and that he would tear out my pockets so far as his struggles and his threats were alike indeed. I cannot tell how many times I struck him. Liberty, blow after blow fell fast and heavy upon his wriggling form. Then did the idea begin to break upon my mind, murder, and at last the blasphemous tyrant called on God for mercy. But he who would never shown mercy, there must have received some misapprehension. The stiff stock of the whip walked round his cringing body until my right arm citizen of New York. Until this time, I had been too busy to violate any law. Desisting for a moment, I saw Mrs. Chapin looking from the window, and Rachel standing in the kitchen door. The more I became confirmed in my suspicions, the utmost excitement. It was a desolate thought indeed. His screams had been heard in the field. Trust or Chapin was coming as fast as he could ride, and commending myself to the God of the oppressed, then pushed him from me with such a well-directed kick that he went rolling over on the ground. Rising to his feet and brushing the dirt from his hair, he stood looking at me, pale with rage. We gazed at each other in silence. Not a word was uttered until Chapin galloped up to us. "What is the matter?" he cried out. "Master Tibeats wants to whip me for using the nails you gave me," I replied. "What is the matter with the nails?" he inquired, turning to Tibeats. Tibeats answered to the effect that they were too large, paying little heed, however, to Chapin's question, but still keeping his snakish eyes fastened maliciously on me. "I am overseer here," Chapin began. "I told Platt to take them and use them, and if they were not of the proper size, I would get others on returning from the field. It is not his fault. Besides, I shall furnish such nails as I please. I hope you will understand that, Mr. Tibeats." Tibeats made no reply, but, grinding his teeth and shaking his fist, swore he would have satisfaction, and that it was not half over yet. Thereupon he walked away, followed by the overseer, and entered the house, the latter talking to him all the while in a suppressed tone, and with earnest gestures. I remained where I was, doubting whether it was better to fly or abide the result, whatever it might be. Presently Tibeats came out of the house, and, saddling his horse, the only property he possessed besides myself, departed on the road to Cheneyville. When he was gone, Chapin came out, visibly excited, telling me not to stir, not to attempt to leave the plantation on any account whatever. He then went to the kitchen, and calling Rachel out, conversed with her some time. Coming back, he again charged me with great earnestness not to run, saying my master was a rascal, that he had left on no good errand, and that there might be trouble before night. But at all events, he insisted upon it, I must not stir. As I stood there, feelings of unutterable agony overwhelmed me. I was conscious that I had subjected myself to unimaginable punishment. The reaction that followed my extreme ebullition of anger produced the most painful sensations of regret. An unfriended, helpless slave, what could I do, what could I say, to justify, in the remotest manner, the heinous act I had committed, of resenting a white man's contumely and abuse? I tried to pray. I tried to beseech my Heavenly Father to sustain me in my sore extremity, but emotion choked my utterance, and I could only bow my head upon my hands and weep. For at least an hour I remained in this situation, finding relief only in tears, when, looking up, I beheld Tibeats, accompanied by 2 horsemen, coming down the bayou. They rode into the yard, jumped from their horses, and approached me with large whips, one of them also carrying a coil of rope. "Cross your hands," commanded Tibeats, with the addition of such a shuddering expression of blasphemy as is not decorous to repeat. "You need not bind me, Master Tibeats. I am ready to go with you anywhere," said I. One of his companions then stepped forward, swearing if I made the least resistance he would break my head, he would tear me limb from limb, he would cut my black throat, and giving wide scope to other similar expressions. Perceiving any importunity altogether vain, I crossed my hands, submitting humbly to whatever disposition they might please to make of me. Thereupon Tibeats tied my wrists, drawing the rope around them with his utmost strength. Then he bound my ankles in the same manner. In the meantime, the other two had slipped a cord within my elbows, running it across my back, and tying it firmly. It was utterly impossible to move hand or foot. With a remaining piece of rope, Tibeats made an awkward noose, and placed it about my neck. "Now then," inquired one of Tibeats' companions, "where shall we hang the nigger?" One proposed such a limb, extending from the body of a peach tree near the spot where we were standing. His comrade objected to it, alleging it would break, and proposed another. Finally, they fixed upon the latter. During this conversation, and all the time they were binding me, I uttered not a word. Overseer Chapin, during the progress of the scene, was walking hastily back and forth on the piazza. Rachel was crying by the kitchen door, and Mrs. Chapin was still looking from the window. Hope died within my heart. Surely my time had come. I should never behold the light of another day, never behold the faces of my children, the sweet anticipation I had cherished with such fondness. I should that hour struggle through the fearful agonies of death. None would mourn for me, none revenge me. Soon my form would be mouldering in that distant soil, or perhaps be cast to the slimy reptiles that filled the stagnant waters of the bayou. Tears flowed down my cheeks, but they only afforded a subject of insulting comment for my executioners. At length, as they were dragging me towards the tree, Chapin, who had momentarily disappeared from the piazza, came out of the house and walked towards us. He had a pistol in each hand, and, as near as I can now recall to mind, spoke in a firm, determined manner as follows: "Gentlemen, I have a few words to say. You had better listen to them. Whoever moves that slave another foot from where he stands is a dead man. In the first place, he does not deserve this treatment. It is a shame to murder him in this manner. I never knew a more faithful boy than Platt. You, Tibeats, are in the fault yourself. You are pretty much of a scoundrel, and I know it, and you richly deserve the flogging you have received. In the next place, I have been overseer on this plantation 7 years, and, in the absence of William Ford, am master here. My duty is to protect his interests, and that duty I shall perform. You are not responsible. You are a worthless fellow. Ford holds a mortgage on Platt of $400. If you hang him, he loses his debt. Until that is cancelled, you have no right to take his life. You have no right to take it anyway. There is a law for the slave as well as for the white man. You are no better than a murderer. As for you," addressing Cook and Ramsey, a couple of overseers from neighboring plantations, "as for you, be gone. If you have any regard for your own safety, I say, be gone." Cook and Ramsey, without a further word, mounted their horses and rode away. Tibeats, in a few minutes, evidently in fear and overawed by the decided tone of Chapin, sneaked off like a coward, as he was, and mounting his horse, followed his companions. I remained standing where I was, still bound, with the rope around my neck. As soon as they were gone, Chapin called Rachel, ordering her to run to the field and tell Lawson to hurry to the house without delay, and bring the brown mule with him, an animal much prized for its unusual fleetness. Presently the boy appeared. "Lawson," said Chapin, "you must go to the Pine Woods. Tell your master Ford to come here at once, that he must not delay a single moment. Tell him they are trying to murder Platt. Now hurry, boy. Be at the Pine Woods by noon if you kill the mule." Chapin stepped into the house and wrote a pass. When he returned, Lawson was at the door, mounted on his mule. Receiving the pass, he plied the whip right smartly to the beast, dashed out of the yard, and turning up the bayou on a hard gallop, in less time than it has taken me to describe the scene, was out of sight. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As the sun approached the meridian that day, it became insufferably warm. Its hot rays scorched the ground. The earth almost blistered the foot that stood upon it. I was without coat or hat, standing bareheaded exposed to its burning blaze. Great drops of perspiration rolled down my face, drenching the scanty apparel wherewith I was clothed. Over the fence, a very little way off, the peach trees cast their cool, delicious shadows on the grass. I would gladly have given a long year of service to have been enabled to exchange the heated oven, as it were, wherein I stood, for a seat beneath their branches. But I was yet bound, the rope still dangling from my neck, and standing in the same tracks where Tibeats and his comrades left me. I could not move an inch, so firmly had I been bound. To have been enabled to lean against the weaving house would have been a luxury indeed, but it was far beyond my reach, though distant less than 20 feet. I wanted to lie down, but knew I could not rise again. The ground was so parched and boiling hot, I was aware it would but add to the discomfort of my situation. If I could have only moved my position, however slightly, it would have been relief unspeakable, but the hot rays of a southern sun, beating all the long summer day on my bare head, produced not half the suffering I experienced from my aching limbs. My wrists and ankles, and the cords of my legs and arms, began to swell, burying the rope that bound them into the swollen flesh. All day Chapin walked back and forth upon the stoop, but not once approached me. He appeared to be in a state of great uneasiness, looking first towards me and then up the road, as if expecting some arrival every moment. He did not go to the field, as was his custom. It was evident from his manner that he supposed Tibeats would return with more and better armed assistance, perhaps to renew the quarrel, and it was equally evident he had prepared his mind to defend my life at whatever hazard. Why he did not relieve me, why he suffered me to remain in agony the whole weary day, I never knew. It was not for want of sympathy, I am certain. Perhaps he wished Ford to see the rope about my neck, and the brutal manner in which I had been bound. Perhaps his interference with another's property, in which he had no legal interest, might have been a trespass, which would have subjected him to the penalty of the law. Why Tibeats was all day absent was another mystery I never could divine. He knew well enough that Chapin would not harm him unless he persisted in his design against me. Lawson told me afterwards that, as he passed the plantation of John David Cheney, he saw the three, and that they turned and looked after him as he flew by. I think his supposition was that Lawson had been sent out by Overseer Chapin to arouse the neighboring planters, and to call on them to come to his assistance. He, therefore, undoubtedly acted on the principle that discretion is the better part of valor, and kept away. But whatever motive may have governed the cowardly and malignant tyrant, it is of no importance. There I still stood in the noontide sun, groaning with pain. From long before daylight I had not eaten a morsel. I was growing faint from pain, and thirst, and hunger. Once only, in the very hottest portion of the day, Rachel, half fearful she was acting contrary to the overseer's wishes, ventured to me and held a cup of water to my lips. The humble creature never knew, nor could she comprehend if she had heard them, the blessings I invoked upon her for that balmy draught. She could only say, "Oh, Platt, how I do pity you," and then hastened back to her labors in the kitchen. Never did the sun move so slowly through the heavens, never did it shower down such fervent and fiery rays as it did that day. At least, so it appeared to me. What my meditations were, the innumerable thoughts that thronged through my distracted brain, I will not attempt to give expression to. Suffice it to say, during the whole long day I came not to the conclusion, even once, that the Southern slave, fed, clothed, whipped, and protected by his master, is happier than the free colored citizen of the North. To that conclusion I have never since arrived. There are many, however, even in the Northern States, benevolent and well-disposed men, who will pronounce my opinion erroneous, and gravely proceed to substantiate the assertion with an argument. Alas, they have never drunk, as I have, from the bitter cup of slavery. Just at sunset, my heart leaped with unbounded joy as Ford came riding into the yard, his horse covered with foam. Chapin met him at the door, and after conversing a short time, he walked directly to me. "Poor Platt, "You are in a bad state," was the only expression that escaped his lips. "Thank God," said I, "thank God, Master Ford, that you have come at last." Drawing a knife from his pocket, he indignantly cut the cord from my wrists, arms, and ankles, and slipped the noose from my neck. I attempted to walk, but staggered like a drunken man, and fell partially to the ground. Ford returned immediately to the house, leaving me alone again. As he reached the piazza, Tibeats and his two friends rode up. A long dialogue followed. I could hear the sound of their voices, the mild tones of Ford mingling with the angry accents of Tibeats, but was unable to distinguish what was said. Finally the three departed again, apparently not well pleased. I endeavored to raise the hammer, thinking to show Ford how willing I was to work, by proceeding with my labors on the weaving house, but it fell from my nerveless hand. At dark I crawled into the cabin and laid down. I was in great misery, all sore and swollen, the slightest movement producing excruciating suffering. Soon the hands came in from the field. Rachel, when she went after Lawson, had told them what had happened. Eliza and Mary broiled me a piece of bacon, but my appetite was gone. They then scorched some cornmeal and made coffee. It was all that I could take. Eliza consoled me and was very kind. It was not long before the cabin was full of slaves. They gathered round me, asking many questions about the difficulty with Tibeats in the morning, and the particulars of all the occurrences of the day. Then Rachel came in, and in her simple language repeated it over again, dwelling emphatically on the kick that sent Tibeats rolling over on the ground, whereupon there was a general titter throughout the crowd. Then she described how Chapin walked out with his pistols and rescued me, and how Master Ford cut the ropes with his knife, just as if he was mad. By this time Lawson had returned. He had to regale them with an account of his trip to the Pine Woods, how the brown mule bore him faster than a streak o' lightning, how he astonished everybody as he flew along, how Master Ford started right away, how he said Platt was a good nigger, and they shouldn't kill him, concluding with pretty strong intimations that there was not another human being in the wide world who could have created such a universal sensation on the road, or performed such a marvelous John Gilpin feat as he had done that day on the brown mule. The kind creatures loaded me with the expression of their sympathy, saying Tibeats was a hard, cruel man, and hoping Massa Ford would get me back again. In this manner they passed the time, discussing, chatting, talking over and over again the exciting affair, until suddenly Chapin presented himself at the cabin door and called me. "Platt," said he, "you will sleep on the floor in the great house tonight. Bring your blanket with you." I arose as quickly as I was able, took my blanket in my hand, and followed him. On the way he informed me that he should not wonder if Tibeats was back again before morning, that he intended to kill me, and that he did not mean he should do it without witnesses. Had he stabbed me to the heart in the presence of 100 slaves, not one of them, by the law of Louisiana, could have given evidence against him. I lay down on the floor in the great house, the first and last time such a sumptuous resting place was granted me during my 12 years of bondage, and tried to sleep. Near midnight the dog began to bark. Chapin arose, looked from the window, but could discover nothing. At length the dog was quiet. As he returned to his room, he said, "I believe, Platt, that scoundrel is skulking about the premises somewhere. If the dog barks again, and I am sleeping, wake me." I promised to do so. After the lapse of an hour or more, the dog recommenced his clamor, running towards the gate, then back again, all the while barking furiously. Chapin was out of bed without waiting to be called. On this occasion he stepped forth upon the piazza, and remained standing there a considerable length of time. Nothing, however, was to be seen, and the dog returned to his kennel. We were not disturbed again during the night. The excessive pain that I had suffered, and the dread of some impending danger, prevented any rest whatever. Whether or not Tibeats did actually return to the plantation that night, seeking an opportunity to wreak his vengeance upon me, is a secret known only to himself, perhaps. I thought then, however, and have the strong impression still that he was there. At all events, he had the disposition of an assassin, cowering before a brave man's words, but ready to strike his helpless or unsuspecting victim in the back, as I had reason afterwards to know. At daylight in the morning, I arose, sore and weary, having rested little. Nevertheless, after partaking breakfast, which Mary and Eliza had prepared for me in the cabin, I proceeded to the weaving house and commenced the labours of another day. It was Chapin's practice, as it is the practice of overseers generally, immediately on rising, to bestride his horse, always saddled and bridled and ready for him, the particular business of some slave, and ride into the field. This morning, on the contrary, he came to the weaving house, asking if I had seen anything of Tibeats yet. Replying in the negative, he remarked there was something not right about the fellow. There was bad blood in him, that I must keep a sharp watch of him, or he would do me wrong some day when I least expected it. While he was yet speaking, Tibeats rode in, hitched his horse, and entered the house. I had little fear of him while Ford and Chapin were at hand, but they could not be near me always. Oh, how heavily the weight of slavery pressed upon me then. I must toil day after day, endure abuse and taunts and scoffs, sleep on the hard ground, live on the coarsest fare, and not only this, but live the slave of a blood-seeking wretch, of whom I must stand henceforth in continued fear and dread. Why had I not died in my young years, before God had given me children to love and live for? What unhappiness and suffering and sorrow it would have prevented. I sighed for liberty, but the bondsman's chain was round me and could not be shaken off. I could only gaze wistfully towards the north, and think of the thousands of miles that stretched between me and the soil of freedom, over which a black freeman may not pass. Tibeats, in the course of half an hour, walked over to the weaving house, looked at me sharply, then returned without saying anything. Most of the forenoon he sat on the piazza, reading a newspaper and conversing with Ford. After dinner, the latter left for the pine woods, and it was indeed with regret that I beheld him depart from the plantation. Once more during the day, Tibeats came to me, gave me some order, and returned. During the week the weaving house was completed, Tibeats in the meantime making no allusion whatever to the difficulty, when I was informed he had hired me to Peter Tanner to work under another carpenter by the name of Myers. This announcement was received with gratification, as any place was desirable that would relieve me of his hateful presence. Peter Tanner, as the reader has already been informed, lived on the opposite shore, and was the brother of Mistress Ford. He is one of the most extensive planters on Bayou Boeuf, and owns a large number of slaves. Over I went to Tanner's, joyfully enough. He had heard of my late difficulties. In fact, I ascertained the flogging of Tibeats was soon blazoned far and wide. This affair, together with my rafting experiment, had rendered me somewhat notorious. More than once I heard it said that Platt Ford, now Platt Tibeats, a slave's name changes with his change of master, was a devil of a nigger. But I was destined to make a still further noise, as will presently be seen, throughout the little world of Bayou Boeuf. Peter Tanner endeavored to impress upon me the idea that he was quite severe, though I could perceive there was a vein of good humor in the old fellow after all. "You're the nigger," he said to me on my arrival. "You're the nigger that flogged your master, eh? You're the nigger that kicks, and holds Carpenter Tibeats by the legs, and wallops him, are you? I'd like to see you hold me by the leg, I should. You're a portent character. You're a great nigger, very remarkable nigger, ain't you? I'd lash you. I'd take the tantrums out of you. Jest take hold of my leg, if you please. None of your pranks here, my boy, remember that. Now go to work, you kicking rascal," concluded Peter Tanner, unable to suppress a half-comical grin at his own wit and sarcasm. After listening to this salutation, I was taken charge of by Myers, and labored under his direction for a month, to his and my own satisfaction. Like William Ford, his brother-in-law, Tanner was in the habit of reading the Bible to his slaves on the Sabbath, but in a somewhat different spirit. He was an impressive commentator on the New Testament. The first Sunday after my coming to the plantation, he called them together and began to read the 12th chapter of Luke. When he came to the 47th verse, he looked deliberately around him and continued, "And that servant which knew his Lord's will," here he paused, looking around more deliberately than before, and again proceeded, "which knew his Lord's will, and prepared not himself." Here was another pause. "Prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes." "D'ye hear that?" demanded Peter emphatically. "Stripes," he repeated, slowly and distinctly, taking off his spectacles, preparatory to making a few remarks. "That nigger that don't take care, that don't obey his Lord, that's his master, d'ye see? That 'ere nigger shall be beaten with many stripes. Now, many signifies a great many. 40, 100, 150 lashes. That's scripter." And so Peter continued to elucidate the subject for a great length of time, much to the edification of his sable audience. At the conclusion of the exercises, calling up 3 of his slaves, Warner, Will, and Major, he cried out to me, "Here, Platt, you held Tibeats by the legs. Now I'll see if you can hold these rascals in the same way, till I get back from meeting." Thereupon he ordered them to the stocks, a common thing on plantations in the Red River country. The stocks are formed of 2 planks, the lower one made fast at the ends to 2 short posts, driven firmly into the ground. At regular distances, half circles are cut in the upper edge. The other plank is fastened to one of the posts by a hinge, so that it can be opened or shut down, in the same manner as the blade of a pocket knife is shut or opened. In the lower edge of the upper plank, corresponding half circles are also cut, so that when they close, a row of holes is formed large enough to admit a negro's leg above the ankle, but not large enough to enable him to draw out his foot. The other end of the upper plank, opposite the hinge, is fastened to its post by lock and key. The slave is made to sit upon the ground, when the uppermost plank is elevated, his legs, just above the ankles, placed in the sub-half circles, and shutting it down again, and locking it, he is held secure and fast. Very often the neck instead of the ankle is enclosed. In this manner they are held during the operation of whipping. Warner, Will, and Major, according to Tanner's account of them, were melon-stealing, Sabbath-breaking niggers, and not approving of such wickedness, he felt it his duty to put them in the stocks. Handing me the key, himself, Myers, Mistress Tanner, and the children entered the carriage and drove away to church at Cheneyville. When they were gone, the boys begged me to let them out. I felt sorry to see them sitting on the hot ground, and remembered my own sufferings in the sun. Upon their promise to return to the stocks at any moment they were required to do so, I consented to release them. Grateful for the lenity shown them, and in order in some measure to repay it, they could do no less, of course, than pilot me to the melon patch. Shortly before Tanner's return, they were in the stocks again. Finally he drove up, and looking at the boys, said, with a chuckle, "Aha! You haven't been strolling about much today, anyway. I'll teach you what's what. I'll tire you of eating watermelons on the Lord's day, ye Sabbath-breaking niggers." Peter Tanner prided himself upon his strict religious observances. He was a deacon in the church. But I have now reached a point in the progress of my narrative when it becomes necessary to turn away from these light descriptions to the more grave and weighty matter of the second battle with Master Tibeats, and the flight through the great Pacudry swamp. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At the end of the month, my services being no longer required at Tanner's, I was sent over to the bayou again to my master, whom I found engaged in building the cotton press. This was situated at some distance from the great house, in a rather retired place. I commenced working once more in company with Tibeats, being entirely alone with him most part of the time. I remembered the words of Chapin, his precautions, his advice to beware, lest in some unsuspecting moment he might injure me. They were always on my mind, so that I lived in a most uneasy state of apprehension and fear. One eye was always on my work, the other on my master. I determined to give him no cause of offence, to work still more diligently, if possible, than I had done, to bear whatever abuse he might heap upon me, save bodily injury, humbly and patiently, hoping thereby to soften in some degree his manner towards me, until the blessed time might come when I should be delivered from his clutches. The third morning after my return, Chapin left the plantation for Cheneyville, to be absent until night. Tibeats, on that morning, was attacked with one of those periodical fits of spleen and ill humour to which he was frequently subject, rendering him still more disagreeable and venomous than usual. It was about 9 o'clock in the forenoon, when I was busily employed with the jack-plane on one of the sweeps. Tibeats was standing by the workbench, fitting a handle into the chisel, with which he had been engaged previously in cutting the thread of the screw. "You are not planing that down enough," said he. "It is just even with the line," I replied. "You're a damned liar," he exclaimed passionately. "Oh well, master," I said mildly, "I will plane it down more if you say so," at the same time proceeding to do as I supposed he desired. Before one shaving had been removed, however, he cried out, saying I had now planed it too deep, it was too small, I had spoiled the sweep entirely. Then followed curses and imprecations. I had endeavored to do exactly as he directed, but nothing would satisfy the unreasonable man. In silence and in dread I stood by the sweep, holding the jack-plane in my hand, not knowing what to do, and not daring to be idle. His anger grew more and more violent, until finally, with an oath, such a bitter, frightful oath as only Tibeats could utter, he seized a hatchet from the workbench and darted towards me, swearing he would cut my head open. It was a moment of life or death. The sharp, bright blade of the hatchet glittered in the sun. In another instant it would be buried in my brain, and yet in that instant, so quick will a man's thoughts come to him in such a fearful strait, I reasoned with myself. If I stood still, my doom was certain. If I fled, 10 chances to 1, the hatchet, flying from his hand with a too deadly and unerring aim, would strike me in the back. There was but one course to take. Springing towards him with all my power, and meeting him full half-way, before he could bring down the blow, with one hand I caught his uplifted arm, with the other seized him by the throat. We stood looking each other in the eyes. In his I could see murder. I felt as if I had a serpent by the neck, watching the slightest relaxation of my grip, to coil itself round my body, crushing and stinging it to death. I thought to scream aloud, trusting that some ear might catch the sound, but Chapin was away. The hands were in the field. There was no living soul in sight or hearing. The good genius, which thus far through life has saved me from the hands of violence, at that moment suggested a lucky thought. With a vigorous and sudden kick, that brought him on one knee with a groan, I released my hold upon his throat, snatched the hatchet, and cast it beyond reach. Frantic with rage, maddened beyond control, he seized a white oak stick, 5 feet long perhaps, and as large in circumference as his hand could grasp, which was lying on the ground. Again he rushed towards me, and again I met him, seized him about the waist, and being the stronger of the two, bore him to the earth. While in that position, I obtained possession of the stick, and rising, cast it from me also. He likewise arose and ran for the broadaxe, on the workbench. Fortunately, there was a heavy plank lying upon its broad blade, in such a manner that he could not extricate it before I had sprung upon his back. Pressing him down closely and heavily on the plank, so that the axe was held more firmly to its place, I endeavored, but in vain, to break his grasp upon the handle. In that position we remained some minutes. There have been hours in my unhappy life, many of them, when the contemplation of death as the end of earthly sorrow of the grave as a resting place for the tired and worn-out body has been pleasant to dwell upon. But such contemplations vanish in the hour of peril. No man in his full strength can stand undismayed in the presence of the King of Terrors. Life is dear to every living thing. The worm that crawls upon the ground will struggle for it. At that moment it was dear to me, enslaved and treated as I was. Not able to unloose his hand, once more I seized him by the throat, and this time with a vice-like grip that soon relaxed his hold. He became pliant and unstrung. His face, that had been white with passion, was now black from suffocation. Those small serpent eyes that spat such venom were now full of horror, two great white orbs starting from their sockets. There was a lurking devil in my heart that prompted me to kill the human bloodhound on the spot, to retain the grip on his accursed throat till the breath of life was gone. I dared not murder him, and I dared not let him live. If I killed him, my life must pay the forfeit. If he lived, my life only would satisfy his vengeance. A voice within me whispered me to fly. To be a wanderer among the swamps, a fugitive and a vagabond on the face of the earth, was preferable to the life that I was leading. My resolution was soon formed, and swinging him from the workbench to the ground, I leaped a fence nearby and hurried across the plantation, passing the slaves at work in the cotton field. At the end of 1/4 mile, I reached the wood pasture, and it was a short time indeed that I had been running it. Climbing onto a high fence, I could see the cotton press, the great house, and the space between. It was a conspicuous position from whence the whole plantation was in view. I saw Tibeats cross the field towards the house and enter it. Then he came out, carrying his saddle, and presently mounted his horse and galloped away. I was desolate, but thankful. Thankful that my life was spared, desolate and discouraged with the prospect before me. What would become of me? Who would befriend me? Whither should I fly? O God, Thou who gavest me life, and implanted in my bosom the love of life, who filled it with emotions such as other men, Thy creatures, have, do not forsake me. Have pity on the poor slave. Let me not perish. If Thou dost not protect me, I am lost. Lost! Such supplications, silently and unuttered, ascended from my inmost heart to heaven. But there was no answering voice, no sweet, low tone coming down from on high, whispering to my soul, "It is I, be not afraid." I was the forsaken of God, it seemed, the despised and hated of men. In about 3/4 of an hour several of the slaves shouted and made signs for me to run. Presently, looking up the bayou, I saw Tibeats and 2 others on horseback coming at a fast gait, followed by a troop of dogs. There were as many as 8 or 10. Distant as I was, I knew them. They belonged on the adjoining plantation. The dogs used on Bayou Boeuf for hunting slaves are a kind of bloodhound, but a far more savage breed than is found in the northern states. They will attack a negro at their master's bidding, and cling to him as the common bulldog will cling to a 4-footed animal. Frequently their loud bay is heard in the swamps, and then there is speculation as to what point the runaway will be overhauled. The same as a New York hunter stops to listen to the hounds coursing along the hillsides, and suggests to his companion that the fox will be taken at such a place. I never knew a slave escaping with his life from Bayou Boeuf. One reason is, they are not allowed to learn the art of swimming, and are incapable of crossing the most inconsiderable stream. In their flight they can go in no direction but a little way, without coming to a bayou, when the inevitable alternative is presented of being drowned or overtaken by the dogs. In youth I had practiced in the clear streams that flow through my native district, until I had become an expert swimmer, and felt at home in the watery element. I stood upon the fence until the dogs had reached the cotton press. In an instant more, their long, savage yells announced they were on my track. Leaping down from my position, I ran towards the swamp. Fear gave me strength, and I exerted it to the utmost. Every few moments I could hear the yelpings of the dogs. They were gaining upon me. Every howl was nearer and nearer. Each moment I expected they would spring upon my back, expected to feel their long teeth sinking into my flesh. There were so many of them, I knew they would tear me to pieces, that they would worry me at once to death. I gasped for breath, gasped forth a half-uttered choking prayer to the Almighty to save me, to give me strength to reach some wide, deep bayou where I could throw them off the track, or sink into its waters. Presently I reached a thick palmetto bottom. As I fled through them they made a loud rustling noise, not loud enough, however, to drown the voices of the dogs. Continuing my course due south, as nearly as I can judge, I came at length to water just over shoe. The hounds at that moment could not have been 5 rods behind me. I could hear them crashing and plunging through the palmettos, their loud, eager yells making the whole swamp clamorous with the sound. Hope revived a little as I reached the water. If it were only deeper, they might lose the scent, and, thus disconcerted, afford me the opportunity of evading them. Luckily, it grew deeper the farther I proceeded, now over my ankles, now halfway to my knees, now sinking a moment to my waist, and then emerging presently into more shallow places. The dogs had not gained upon me since I struck the water. Evidently they were confused. Now their savage intonations grew more and more distant, assuring me that I was leaving them. Finally I stopped to listen, but the long howl came booming on the air again, telling me I was not yet safe. From bog to bog, where I had stepped, they could still keep upon the track, though impeded by the water. At length, to my great joy, I came to a wide bayou, and plunging in, had soon stemmed its sluggish current to the other side. There, certainly, the dogs would be confounded, the current carrying down the stream all traces of that slight, mysterious scent which enables the quick-smelling hound to follow in the track of the fugitive. After crossing the bayou, the water became so deep I could not run. I was now in what I afterwards learned was the great Pacudry swamp. It was filled with immense trees, the sycamore, the gum, the cottonwood and cypress, and extends, I am informed, to the shore of the Calcasieu River. For 30 or 40 miles it is without inhabitants, save wild beasts, the bear, the wildcat, the tiger, and great slimy reptiles that are crawling through it everywhere. Long before I reached the bayou, in fact, from the time I struck the water until I emerged from the swamp on my return, these reptiles surrounded me. I saw hundreds of moccasin snakes. Every log and bog, every trunk of a fallen tree over which I was compelled to step or climb, was alive with them. They crawled away at my approach, but sometimes in my haste I almost placed my hand or foot upon them. They are poisonous serpents, their bite more fatal than the rattlesnakes. Besides, I had lost one shoe, the sole having come entirely off, leaving the upper only dangling to my ankle. I saw also many alligators, great and small, lying in the water or on pieces of flood wood. The noise I made usually startled them, when they moved off and plunged into the deepest places. Sometimes, however, I would come directly upon a monster before observing it. In such cases I would start back, run a short way round, and in that manner shun them. Straight forward they will run a short distance rapidly, but do not possess the power of turning. In a crooked race, there is no difficulty in evading them. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the last of the hounds. Probably they did not cross the bayou. Wet and weary, but relieved from the sense of instant peril, I continued on, more cautious and afraid, however, of the snakes and alligators than I had been in the earlier portion of my flight. Now, before stepping into a muddy pool, I would strike the water with a stick. If the waters moved, I would go around it. If not, would venture through. At length the sun went down, and gradually night's trailing mantle shrouded the great swamp in darkness. Still I staggered on, fearing every instant I should feel the dreadful sting of the moccasin, or be crushed within the jaws of some disturbed alligator. The dread of them now almost equaled the fear of the pursuing hounds. The moon arose after a time, its mild light creeping through the overspreading branches, loaded with long, pendant moss. I kept travelling forwards until after midnight, hoping all the while that I would soon emerge into some less desolate and dangerous region. But the water grew deeper and the walking more difficult than ever. I perceived it would be impossible to proceed much farther, and knew not, moreover, what hands I might fall into, should I succeed in reaching a human habitation. Not provided with a pass, any white man would be at liberty to arrest me, and place me in prison until such time as my master should prove property, pay charges, and take me away. I was an estray, and if so unfortunate as to meet a law-abiding citizen of Louisiana, he would deem it his duty to his neighbor, perhaps, to put me forthwith in the pound. Really, it was difficult to determine which I had most reason to fear, dogs, alligators, or men. After midnight, however, I came to a halt. Imagination cannot picture the dreariness of the scene. The swamp was resonant with the quacking of innumerable ducks. Since the foundation of the earth, in all probability, a human footstep had never before so far penetrated the recesses of the swamp. It was not silent now, silent to a degree that rendered it oppressive, as it was when the sun was shining in the heavens. My midnight intrusion had awakened the feathered tribes, which seemed to throng the morass in hundreds of thousands, and their garrulous throats poured forth such multitudinous sounds. There was such a fluttering of wings, such sullen plunges in the water all around me, that I was affrighted and appalled. All the fowls of the air, and all the creeping things of the earth, appeared to have assembled together in that particular place, for the purpose of filling it with clamor and confusion. Not by human dwellings, not in crowded cities alone, are the sights and sounds of life. The wildest places of the earth are full of them. Even in the heart of that dismal swamp, God had provided a refuge and a dwelling place for millions of living things. The moon had now risen above the trees, when I resolved upon a new project. Thus far I had endeavored to travel as nearly south as possible. Turning about, I proceeded in a northwest direction, my object being to strike the pine woods in the vicinity of Master Ford's. Once within the shadow of his protection, I felt I would be comparatively safe. My clothes were in tatters, my hands, face, and body covered with scratches received from the sharp knots of fallen trees, and in climbing over piles of brush and floodwood. My bare foot was full of thorns. I was besmeared with muck and mud, and the green slime that had collected on the surface of the dead water, in which I had been immersed to the neck many times during the day and night. Hour after hour, and tiresome indeed had they become, I continued to plod along on my northwest course. The water began to grow less deep, and the ground more firm under my feet. At last I reached the Pacudry, the same wide bayou I had swam while outward bound. I swam it again, and shortly after thought I heard a cock crow, but the sound was faint, and it might have been a mockery of the ear. The water receded from my advancing footsteps. Now I had left the bogs behind me. Now I was on dry land that gradually ascended to the plain, and I knew I was somewhere in the great pine woods. Just at daybreak I came to an opening, a sort of small plantation, but one I had never seen before. In the edge of the woods I came upon two men, a slave and his young master, engaged in catching wild hogs. The white man I knew would demand my pass, and not able to give him one, would take me into possession. I was too wearied to run again, and too desperate to be taken, and therefore adopted a ruse that proved entirely successful. Assuming a fierce expression, I walked directly towards him, looking him steadily in the face. As I approached, he moved backwards with an air of alarm. It was plain he was much affrighted, that he looked upon me as some infernal goblin just arisen from the bowels of the swamp. "Where does William Ford live?" I demanded in no gentle tone. "He lives 7 miles from here," was the reply. "Which is the way to his place?" I again demanded, trying to look more fiercely than ever. "Do you see those pine trees yonder?" he asked, pointing to 2, a mile distant, that rose far above their fellows, like a couple of tall sentinels overlooking the broad expanse of forest. "I see them," was the answer. "At the feet of those pine trees," he continued, "runs the Texas road. Turn to the left, and it will lead you to William Ford's." Without further parley, I hastened forward, happy as he was, no doubt, to place the widest possible distance between us. Striking the Texas road, I turned to the left hand, as directed, and soon passed a great fire, where a pile of logs were burning. I went to it, thinking I would dry my clothes, but the gray light of the morning was fast breaking away. Some passing white man might observe me. Besides, the heat overpowered me with the desire of sleep, so, lingering no longer, I continued my travels, and finally, about 8 o'clock, reached the house of Master Ford. The slaves were all absent from the quarters, at their work. Stepping onto the piazza, I knocked at the door, which was soon opened by Mistress Ford. My appearance was so changed, I was in such a woe-begone and forlorn condition, she did not know me. Inquiring if Master Ford was at home, that good man made his appearance before the question could be answered. I told him of my flight, and all the particulars connected with it. He listened attentively, and when I had concluded, spoke to me kindly and sympathetically, and taking me to the kitchen, called John and ordered him to prepare me food. I had tasted nothing since daylight the previous morning. When John had set the meal before me, the madam came out with a bowl of milk, and many little delicious dainties, such as rarely please the palate of a slave. I was hungry and I was weary, but neither food nor rest afforded half the pleasure as did the blessed voices speaking kindness and consolation. It was the oil and the wine which the good Samaritan in the great pine woods was ready to pour into the wounded spirit of the slave, who came to him, stripped of his raiment, and half dead. They left me in the cabin, that I might rest. Blessed be sleep! It visiteth all alike, descending as the dews of heaven on the bond and free. Soon it nestled to my bosom, driving away the troubles that oppressed it, and bearing me to that shadowy region where I saw again the faces and listened to the voices of my children, who, alas, for aught I knew in my waking hours, had fallen into the arms of that other sleep, from which they never would arouse. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After a long sleep, sometime in the afternoon I awoke, refreshed but very sore and stiff. Sally came in and talked with me, while John cooked me some dinner. Sally was in great trouble, as well as myself, one of her children being ill, and she feared it could not survive. Dinner over, after walking about the quarters for a while, visiting Sally's cabin and looking at the sick child, I strolled into the madam's garden. Though it was a season of the year when the voices of the birds are silent, and the trees are stripped of their summer glories in more frigid climes, yet the whole variety of roses were then blooming there, and the long luxuriant vines creeping over the frames. The crimson and golden fruit hung half hidden amidst the younger and older blossoms of the peach, the orange, the plum, and the pomegranate. For in that region of almost perpetual warmth, the leaves are falling and the buds bursting into bloom the whole year long. I indulged the most grateful feelings towards Master and Mistress Ford, and wishing in some manner to repay their kindness, commenced trimming the vines, and afterwards weeding out the grass from among the orange and pomegranate trees. The latter grows 8 or 10 feet high, and its fruit, though larger, is similar in appearance to the jelly flower. It has the luscious flavor of the strawberry. Oranges, peaches, plums, and most other fruits are indigenous to the rich, warm soil of Avoyelles, but the apple, the most common of them all in colder latitudes, is rarely to be seen. Mistress Ford came out presently, saying it was praiseworthy in me, but I was not in a condition to labor, and might rest myself at the quarters until master should go down to Bayou Boeuf, which would not be that day, and it might not be the next. I said to her, to be sure I felt bad, and was stiff, and that my foot pained me, the stubs and thorns having so torn it, but thought such exercise would not hurt me, and that it was a great pleasure to work for so good a mistress. Thereupon she returned to the great house, and for 3 days I was diligent in the garden, cleaning the walks, weeding the flower beds, and pulling up the rank grass beneath the jessamine vines, which the gentle and generous hand of my protectress had taught to clamber along the walls. The 4th morning, having become recruited and refreshed, Master Ford ordered me to make ready to accompany him to the bayou. There was but one saddle horse at the opening, all the others with the mules having been sent down to the plantation. I said I could walk, and bidding Sally and John good-bye, left the opening, trotting along by the horse's side. That little paradise in the great pine woods was the oasis in the desert, towards which my heart turned lovingly during many years of bondage. I went forth from it now with regret and sorrow, not so overwhelming, however, as if it had then been given me to know that I should never return to it again. Master Ford urged me to take his place occasionally on the horse, to rest me, but I said no, I was not tired, and it was better for me to walk than him. He said many kind and cheering things to me on the way, riding slowly, in order that I might keep pace with him. The goodness of God was manifest, he declared, in my miraculous escape from the swamp. As Daniel came forth unharmed from the den of lions, and as Jonah had been preserved in the whale's belly, even so had I been delivered from evil by the Almighty. He interrogated me in regard to the various fears and emotions I had experienced during the day and night, and if I had felt at any time a desire to pray. I felt forsaken of the whole world, I answered him, and was praying mentally all the while. At such times, said he, the heart of man turns instinctively towards his Maker. In prosperity, and when there is nothing to injure or make him afraid, he remembers him not, and is ready to defy him. But place him in the midst of dangers, cut him off from human aid, let the grave open before him, then it is, in the time of his tribulation, that the scoffer and unbelieving man turns to God for help, feeling there is no other hope, or refuge, or safety save in his protecting arm. So did that benignant man speak to me of this life and of the life hereafter, of the goodness and power of God, and of the vanity of earthly things as we journeyed along the solitary road towards Bayou Boeuf. When within some 5 miles of the plantation, we discovered a horseman at a distance, galloping towards us. As he came near, I saw that it was Tibeats. He looked at me a moment, but did not address me, and turning about, rode along side by side with Ford. I trotted silently at their horses' heels, listening to their conversation. Ford informed him of my arrival in the pine woods 3 days before, of the sad plight I was in, and of the difficulties and dangers I had encountered. "Well," exclaimed Tibeats, omitting his usual oaths in the presence of Ford, "I never saw such running before. I'll bet him against $100 he'll beat any nigger in Louisiana. I offered John David Cheney $25 to catch him, dead or alive, but he outran his dogs in a fair race. Them Cheney dogs ain't much after all. Dunwoody's hounds would have had him down before he touched the palmettos. Somehow the dogs got off the track, and we had to give up the hunt. We rode the horses as far as we could, and then kept on foot till the water was 3 feet deep. The boys said he was drowned, sure. I allow I wanted a shot at him mightily. Ever since I have been riding up and down the bayou, but hadn't much hope of catching him. Thought he was dead, certain. Oh, he's a cuss to run, that nigger is." In this way Tibeats ran on, describing his search in the swamp, the wonderful speed with which I had fled before the hounds, and when he had finished, Master Ford responded by saying I had always been a willing and faithful boy with him, that he was sorry we had such trouble, that, according to Platt's story, he had been inhumanly treated, and that he, Tibeats, was himself in fault. Using hatchets and broadaxes upon slaves was shameful and should not be allowed, he remarked. This is no way of dealing with them when first brought into the country. It will have a pernicious influence and set them all running away. The swamps will be full of them. A little kindness would be far more effectual in restraining them and rendering them obedient than the use of such deadly weapons. Every planter on the bayou should frown upon such inhumanity. It is for the interest of all to do so. It is evident enough, Mr. Tibeats, that you and Platt cannot live together. You dislike him and would not hesitate to kill him, and knowing it, he will run from you again through fear of his life. Now, Tibeats, you must sell him or hire him out at least. Unless you do so, I shall take measures to get him out of your possession." In this spirit Ford addressed him the remainder of the distance. I opened not my mouth. On reaching the plantation, they entered the great house, while I repaired to Eliza's cabin. The slaves were astonished to find me there on returning from the field, supposing I was drowned. That night, again, they gathered about the cabin to listen to the story of my adventure. They took it for granted I would be whipped, and that it would be severe, the well-known penalty of running away being 500 lashes. "Poor fellow," said Eliza, taking me by the hand, "it would have been better for you if you had drowned. You have a cruel master, and he will kill you yet, I am afraid." Lawson suggested that it might be Overseer Chapin would be appointed to inflict the punishment, in which case it would not be severe. Whereupon Mary, Rachel, Bristol, and others hoped it would be Master Ford, and then it would be no whipping at all. They all pitied me and tried to console me, and were sad in view of the castigation that awaited me, except Kentucky John. There were no bounds to his laughter. He filled the cabin with cachinnations, holding his sides to prevent an explosion, and the cause of his noisy mirth was the idea of my outstripping the hounds. Somehow he looked at the subject in a comical light. "I knowed they wouldn't cotch him when he run cross the plantation. Oh, dear law, didn't Platt pick his feet right up though, eh? When dem dogs got where he wasn't there. Haw, haw, haw. Oh, dear law almighty." And then Kentucky John relapsed into another of his boisterous fits. Early the next morning, Tibeats left the plantation. In the course of the forenoon, while sauntering about the gin house, a tall, good-looking man came to me and inquired if I was Tibeats' boy, that youthful appellation being applied indiscriminately to slaves even though they may have passed the number of 70 years. I took off my hat and answered that I was. "How would you like to work for me?" he inquired. "Oh, I would like to, very much," said I, inspired with a sudden hope of getting away from Tibeats. "You worked under Myers at Peter Tanner's, didn't you?" I replied I had, adding some complimentary remarks that Myers had made concerning me. "Well, boy," said he, "I have hired you of your master to work for me in the Big Cane Break, 38 miles from here, down on Red River." This man was Mr. Eldret, who lived below Ford's, on the same side of the bayou. I accompanied him to his plantation, and in the morning started with his slave Sam and a wagon load of provisions, drawn by 4 mules, for the Big Cane, Eldret and Myers having preceded us on horseback. This Sam was a native of Charleston, where he had a mother, brother, and sisters. He allowed, a common word among both black and white, that Tibeats was a mean man, and hoped, as I most earnestly did also, that his master would buy me. We proceeded down the south shore of the bayou, crossing it at Carey's plantation, from thence to Huff Power, passing which we came upon the Bayou Rouge road, which runs towards Red River. After passing through Bayou Rouge swamp, and just at sunset, turning from the highway, we struck into the Big Cane Break. We followed an unbeaten track, scarcely wide enough to admit the wagon. The cane, such as are used for fishing rods, were as thick as they could stand. A person could not be seen through them the distance of a rod. The paths of wild beasts run through them in various directions, the bear and the American tiger abounding in these breaks, and wherever there is a basin of stagnant water, it is full of alligators. We kept on our lonely course through the Big Cane several miles, when we entered a clearing known as Sutton's Field. Many years before, a man by the name of Sutton had penetrated the wilderness of cane to this solitary place. Tradition has it that he fled thither, a fugitive, not from service, but from justice. Here he lived alone, recluse and hermit of the swamp, with his own hands planting the seed and gathering in the harvest. One day a band of Indians stole upon his solitude, and, after a bloody battle, overpowered and massacred him. For miles the country round, in the slaves' quarters, and on the piazzas of great houses, where white children listen to superstitious tales, the story goes that that spot, in the heart of the Big Cane, is a haunted place. For more than a quarter of a century, human voices had rarely, if ever, disturbed the silence of the clearing. Rank and noxious weeds had overspread the once cultivated field. Serpents sunned themselves on the doorway of the crumbling cabin. It was indeed a dreary picture of desolation. Passing Sutton's Field, we followed a new-cut road 2 miles farther, which brought us to its termination. We had now reached the wild lands of Mr. Eldret, where he contemplated clearing up an extensive plantation. We went to work next morning with our cane knives, and cleared a sufficient space to allow the erection of 2 cabins, one for Myers and Eldret, the other for Sam, myself, and the slaves that were to join us. We were now in the midst of trees of enormous growth, whose wide-spreading branches almost shut out the light of the sun, while the space between the trunks was an impervious mass of cane, with here and there an occasional palmetto. The bay and the sycamore, the oak and the cypress, reach a growth unparalleled in those fertile lowlands bordering the Red River. From every tree, moreover, hang long, large masses of moss, presenting to the eye unaccustomed to them a strange and singular appearance. This moss, in large quantities, is sent north, and there used for manufacturing purposes. We cut down oaks, split them into rails, and with these erected temporary cabins. We covered the roofs with the broad palmetto leaf, an excellent substitute for shingles, as long as they last. The greatest annoyance I met with here were small flies, gnats, and mosquitoes. They swarmed the air. They penetrated the porches of the ear, the nose, the eyes, the mouth. They sucked themselves beneath the skin. It was impossible to brush or beat them off. It seemed, indeed, as if they would devour us, carry us away piecemeal in their small, tormenting mouths. A lonelier spot, or one more disagreeable than the center of the Big Cane Brake, it would be difficult to conceive. Yet to me it was a paradise, in comparison with any other place in the company of Master Tibeats. I labored hard, and oft-times was weary and fatigued, yet I could lie down at night in peace, and arise in the morning without fear. In the course of a fortnight, 4 black girls came down from Eldret's plantation: Charlotte, Fanny, Cressia, and Nellie. They were all large and stout. Axes were put into their hands, and they were sent out with Sam and myself to cut trees. They were excellent choppers, the largest oak or sycamore standing but a brief season before their heavy and well-directed blows. At piling logs they were equal to any man. There are lumber women as well as lumber men in the forests of the South. In fact, in the region of the Bayou Boeuf, they perform their share of all the labor required on the plantation. They plow, drag, drive team, clear wild lands, work on the highway, and so forth. Some planters, owning large cotton and sugar plantations, have none other than the labor of slave women. Such an one is Jim Burns, who lives on the north shore of the bayou, opposite the plantation of John Fogerman. On our arrival in the Brake, Eldret promised me, if I worked well, I might go up to visit my friends at Ford's in 4 weeks. On Saturday night of the 5th week, I reminded him of his promise, when he told me I had done so well that I might go. I had set my heart upon it, and Eldret's announcement thrilled me with pleasure. I was to return in time to commence the labors of the day on Tuesday morning. While indulging the pleasant anticipation of so soon meeting my old friends again, suddenly the hateful form of Tibeats appeared among us. He inquired how Myers and Platt got along together, and was told very well, and that Platt was going up to Ford's plantation in the morning on a visit. "Poh, poh," sneered Tibeats, "it isn't worth while. The nigger will get unsteady. He can't go." But Eldret insisted I had worked faithfully. that he had given me his promise, and that, under the circumstances, I ought not to be disappointed. They then, it being about dark, entered one cabin and I the other. I could not give up the idea of going. It was a sore disappointment. Before morning I resolved, if Eldred made no objection, to leave at all hazards. At daylight I was at his door, with my blanket rolled up into a bundle and hanging on a stick over my shoulder, waiting for a pass. Tibeats came out presently in one of his disagreeable moods, washed his face, and going to a stump nearby, sat down upon it, apparently busily thinking with himself. After standing there a long time, impelled by a sudden impulse of impatience, I started off. "Are you going without a pass?" he cried out to me. "Yes, master, I thought I would," I answered. "How do you think you'll get there?" demanded he. "Don't know," was all the reply I made him. "You'd be taken and sent to jail, where you ought to be, before you got halfway there," he added, passing into the cabin as he said it. He came out soon with the pass in his hand, and calling me a damned nigger that deserved 100 lashes, threw it on the ground. I picked it up and hurried away right speedily. A slave caught off his master's plantation without a pass may be seized and whipped by any white man whom he meets. The one I now received was dated and read as follows: "Platt has permission to go to Ford's plantation on Bayou Boeuf and return by Tuesday morning. John M. Tibeats." This is the usual form. On the way, a great many demanded it, read it, and passed on. Those having the air and appearance of gentlemen, whose dress indicated the possession of wealth, frequently took no notice of me whatever, but a shabby fellow, an unmistakable loafer, never failed to hail me, and to scrutinize and examine me in the most thorough manner. Catching runaways is sometimes a money-making business. If, after advertising, no owner appears, they may be sold to the highest bidder, and certain fees are allowed the finder for his services, at all events, even if reclaimed. A mean white, therefore, a name applied to the species loafer, considers it a godsend to meet an unknown negro without a pass. There are no inns along the highways in that portion of the state where I sojourned. I was wholly destitute of money, neither did I carry any provisions on my journey from the Big Cane to Bayou Boeuf. Nevertheless, with his pass in his hand, a slave need never suffer from hunger or from thirst. It is only necessary to present it to the master or overseer of a plantation and state his wants, when he will be sent round to the kitchen and provided with food or shelter, as the case may require. The traveler stops at any house and calls for a meal with as much freedom as if it was a public tavern. It is the general custom of the country. Whatever their faults may be, it is certain the inhabitants along Red River and around the bayous in the interior of Louisiana are not wanting in hospitality. I arrived at Ford's plantation towards the close of the afternoon, passing the evening in Eliza's cabin, with Lawson, Rachel, and others of my acquaintance. When we left Washington, Eliza's form was round and plump. She stood erect, and in her silks and jewels presented a picture of graceful strength and elegance. Now she was but a thin shadow of her former self. Her face had become ghastly haggard, and the once straight and active form was bowed down, as if bearing the weight of 100 years. Crouching on her cabin floor, and clad in the coarse garments of a slave, old Elisha Berry would not have recognized the mother of his child. I never saw her afterwards. Having become useless in the cotton field, she was bartered for a trifle to some man residing in the vicinity of Peter Compton's. Grief had gnawed remorselessly at her heart until her strength was gone, and for that, her last master, it is said, lashed and abused her most unmercifully. But he could not whip back the departed vigor of her youth, nor straighten up that bended body to its full height, such as it was when her children were around her, and the light of freedom was shining on her path. I learned the particulars relative to her departure from this world from some of Compton's slaves, who had come over Red River to the bayou to assist young Madam Tanner during the busy season. She became, at length, they said, utterly helpless, for several weeks lying on the ground floor in a dilapidated cabin, dependent upon the mercy of her fellow thralls for an occasional drop of water and a morsel of food. Her master did not knock her on the head, as is sometimes done to put a suffering animal out of misery, but left her unprovided for, and unprotected, to linger through a life of pain and wretchedness to its natural close. When the hands returned from the field one night, they found her dead. During the day, the angel of the Lord, who moveth invisibly over all the earth, gathering in his harvest of departing souls, had silently entered the cabin of the dying woman and taken her from thence. She was free at last. Next day, rolling up my blanket, I started on my return to the Big Cane. After traveling 5 miles, at a place called Huff Power, the ever-present Tibeats met me in the road. He inquired why I was going back so soon, and when informed I was anxious to return by the time I was directed, he said I need go no farther than the next plantation, as he had that day sold me to Edwin Epps. We walked down into the yard, where we met the latter gentleman, who examined me and asked me the usual questions propounded by purchasers. Having been duly delivered over, I was ordered to the quarters, and at the same time directed to make a hoe and axe handle for myself. I was now no longer the property of Tibeats, his dog, his brute, dreading his wrath and cruelty day and night, and whoever or whatever my new master might prove to be, I could not, certainly, regret the change. So it was good news when the sale was announced, and with a sigh of relief I sat down for the first time in my new abode. Tibeats soon after disappeared from that section of the country. Once afterwards, and only once, I caught a glimpse of him. It was many miles from Bayou Boeuf. He was seated in the doorway of a low groggery. I was passing in a drove of slaves through St. Mary's Parish. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Edwin Epps, of whom much will be said during the remainder of this history, is a large, portly, heavy-bodied man with light hair, high cheekbones, and a Roman nose of extraordinary dimensions. He has blue eyes, a fair complexion, and is, as I should say, full 6 feet high. He has the sharp, inquisitive expression of a jockey. His manners are repulsive and coarse, and his language gives speedy and unequivocal evidence that he has never enjoyed the advantages of an education. He has the faculty of saying most provoking things, in that respect even excelling old Peter Tanner. At the time I came into his possession, Edwin Epps was fond of the bottle, his sprees sometimes extending over the space of 2 whole weeks. Latterly, however, he had reformed his habits, and when I left him, was as strict a specimen of temperance as could be found on Bayou Boeuf. When, in his cups, Master Epps was a roistering, blustering, noisy fellow, whose chief delight was in dancing with his niggers, or lashing them about the yard with his long whip, just for the pleasure of hearing them screech and scream, as the great welts were planted on their backs. When sober, he was silent, reserved, and cunning, not beating us indiscriminately, as in his drunken moments, but sending the end of his rawhide to some tender spot of a lagging slave, with a sly dexterity peculiar to himself. He had been a driver and overseer in his younger years, but at this time was in possession of a plantation on Bayou Huff Power, 2½ miles from Holmesville, 18 from Marksville, and 12 from Cheneyville. It belonged to Joseph B. Roberts, his wife's uncle, and was leased by Epps. His principal business was raising cotton, and inasmuch as some may read this book who have never seen a cotton field, a description of the manner of its culture may not be out of place. The ground is prepared by throwing up beds or ridges with the plough. Back furrowing it is called. Oxen and mules, the latter almost exclusively, are used in ploughing. The women as frequently as the men perform this labor, feeding, currying, and taking care of their teams, and in all respects doing the field and stable work precisely as do the ploughboys of the north. The beds, or ridges, are 6 feet wide. that is from water furrow to water furrow. A plough drawn by one mule is then run along the top of the ridge or center of the bed, making the drill, into which a girl usually drops the seed, which she carries in a bag hung round her neck. Behind her comes a mule and harrow, covering up the seed, so that 2 mules, 3 slaves, a plough and harrow are employed in planting a row of cotton. This is done in the months of March and April. Corn is planted in February. When there are no cold rains, the cotton usually makes its appearance in a week. In the course of 8 or 10 days afterwards, the first hoeing is commenced. This is performed in part, also, by the aid of the plough and mule. The plough passes as near as possible to the cotton on both sides, throwing the furrow from it. Slaves follow with their hoes, cutting up the grass and cotton, leaving hills 2.5 feet apart. This is called scraping cotton. In 2 weeks more commences the second hoeing. This time the furrow is thrown towards the cotton. Only one stalk, the largest, is now left standing in each hill. In another fortnight it is hoed the third time, throwing the furrow towards the cotton in the same manner as before, and killing all the grass between the rows. About the 1st of July, when it is a foot high or thereabouts, it is hoed the 4th and last time. Now the whole space between the rows is ploughed, leaving a deep water furrow in the center. During all these hoeings, the overseer or driver follows the slaves on horseback with a whip, such as has been described. The fastest hoer takes the lead row. He is usually about a rod in advance of his companions. If one of them passes him, he is whipped. If one falls behind or is a moment idle, he is whipped. In fact, the lash is flying from morning until night the whole day long. The hoeing season thus continues from April until July, a field having no sooner been finished once than it is commenced again. In the latter part of August begins the cotton picking season. At this time each slave is presented with a sack. A strap is fastened to it, which goes over the neck, holding the mouth of the sack breast high, while the bottom reaches nearly to the ground. Each one is also presented with a large basket that will hold about 2 barrels. This is to put the cotton in when the sack is filled. The baskets are carried to the field and placed at the beginning of the rows. When a new hand, one unaccustomed to the business, is sent for the first time into the field, he is whipped up smartly and made for that day to pick as fast as he can possibly. At night it is weighed, so that his capability in cotton picking is known. He must bring in the same weight each night following. If it falls short, it is considered evidence that he has been laggard, and a greater or less number of lashes is the penalty. An ordinary day's work is 200 pounds. A slave who is accustomed to picking is punished if he or she brings in a less quantity than that. There is a great difference among them as regards this kind of labor. Some of them seem to have a natural knack or quickness which enables them to pick with great celerity and with both hands, while others, with whatever practice or industry, are utterly unable to come up to the ordinary standard. Such hands are taken from the cotton field and employed in other business. Patsy, of whom I shall have more to say, was known as the most remarkable cotton picker on Bayou Boeuf. She picked with both hands and with such surprising rapidity that 500 pounds a day was not unusual for her. Each one is tasked, therefore, according to his picking abilities, none, however, to come short of 200 weight. I, being unskillful always in that business, would have satisfied my master by bringing in the latter quantity, while on the other hand, Patsy would surely have been beaten if she failed to produce twice as much. The cotton grows from 5 to 7 feet high, each stalk having a great many branches, shooting out in all directions, and lapping each other above the water furrow. There are few sights more pleasant to the eye than a wide cotton field when it is in the bloom. It presents an appearance of purity, like an immaculate expanse of light, new-fallen snow. Sometimes the slave picks down one side of a row, and back upon the other, but more usually there is one on either side, gathering all that has blossomed, leaving the unopened bolls for a succeeding picking. When the sack is filled, it is emptied into the basket and trodden down. It is necessary to be extremely careful the first time going through the field, in order not to break the branches off the stalks. The cotton will not bloom upon a broken branch. Epps never failed to inflict the severest chastisement on the unlucky servant who, either carelessly or unavoidably, was guilty in the least degree in this respect. The hands are required to be in the cotton field as soon as it is light in the morning, and with the exception of 10 or 15 minutes, which is given them at noon to swallow their allowance of cold bacon, they are not permitted to be a moment idle until it is too dark to see, and when the moon is full, they oftentimes labor till the middle of the night. They do not dare to stop even at dinner time, nor return to the quarters, however late it be, until the order to halt is given by the driver. The day's work over in the field, the baskets are toted, or in other words, carried to the gin house, where the cotton is weighed. No matter how fatigued and weary he may be, no matter how much he longs for sleep and rest, a slave never approaches the gin house with his basket of cotton but with fear. If it falls short in weight, if he has not performed the full task appointed him, he knows that he must suffer. And if he has exceeded it by 10 or 20 pounds, in all probability his master will measure the next day's task accordingly. So, whether he has too little or too much, his approach to the gin house is always with fear and trembling. Most frequently they have too little, and therefore it is they are not anxious to leave the field. After weighing, follow the whippings, and then the baskets are carried to the cotton house and their contents stored away like hay, all hands being sent in to tramp it down. If the cotton is not dry, instead of taking it to the gin house at once, it is laid upon platforms, 2 feet high and some 3 times as wide, covered with boards or plank, with narrow walks running between them. This done, the labor of the day is not yet ended by any means. Each one must then attend to his respective chores. One feeds the mules, another the swine, another cuts the wood, and so forth. Besides, the packing is all done by candlelight. Finally, at a late hour, they reach the quarters, sleepy and overcome with the long day's toil. Then a fire must be kindled in the cabin, the corn ground in the small hand mill, and supper and dinner for the next day in the field prepared. All that is allowed them is corn and bacon, which is given out at the corn crib and smokehouse every Sunday morning. Each one receives, as his weekly allowance, 3½ pounds of bacon, and corn enough to make a peck of meal. That is all. No tea, coffee, sugar, and, with the exception of a very scanty sprinkling now and then, no salt. I can say, from a 10 years' residence with Master Epps, that no slave of his is ever likely to suffer from the gout, superinduced by excessive high living. Master Epps' hogs were fed on shelled corn. It was thrown out to his "niggers" in the ear. The former he thought would fatten faster by shelling, and soaking it in the water. The latter, perhaps, if treated in the same manner, might grow too fat to labor. Master Epps was a shrewd calculator, and knew how to manage his own animals, drunk or sober. The corn mill stands in the yard beneath a shelter. It is like a common coffee mill, the hopper holding about 6 quarts. There was one privilege which Master Epps granted freely to every slave he had. They might grind their corn nightly, in such small quantities as their daily wants required, or they might grind the whole week's allowance at one time, on Sundays, just as they preferred. A very generous man was Master Epps. I kept my corn in a small wooden box, the meal in a gourd. And, by the way, the gourd is one of the most convenient and necessary utensils on a plantation. Besides supplying the place of all kinds of crockery in a slave cabin, it is used for carrying water to the fields. Another, also, contains the dinner. It dispenses with the necessity of pails, dippers, basins, and such tin and wooden superfluities altogether. When the corn is ground, and fire is made, the bacon is taken down from the nail on which it hangs, a slice cut off and thrown upon the coals to broil. The majority of slaves have no knife, much less a fork. They cut their bacon with the axe at the woodpile. The corn meal is mixed with a little water, placed in the fire, and baked. When it is "done brown," the ashes are scraped off, and being placed upon a chip, which answers for a table, the tenant of the slave hut is ready to sit down upon the ground to supper. By this time it is usually midnight. The same fear of punishment with which they approach the gin house possesses them again on lying down to get a snatch of rest. It is the fear of oversleeping in the morning. Such an offense would certainly be attended with not less than 20 lashes. With a prayer that he may be on his feet and wide awake at the first sound of the horn, he sinks to his slumbers nightly. The softest couches in the world are not to be found in the log mansion of the slave. The one whereon I reclined year after year was a plank 12 inches wide and 10 feet long. My pillow was a stick of wood. The bedding was a coarse blanket, and not a rag or shred beside. Moss might be used, were it not that it directly breeds a swarm of fleas. The cabin is constructed of logs, without floor or window. The latter is altogether unnecessary, the crevices between the logs admitting sufficient light. In stormy weather, the rain drives through them, rendering it comfortless and extremely disagreeable. The rude door hangs on great wooden hinges. In one end is constructed an awkward fireplace. An hour before daylight the horn is blown. Then the slaves arouse, prepare their breakfast, fill a gourd with water, in another deposit their dinner of cold bacon and corn cake, and hurry to the field again. It is an offense invariably followed by a flogging to be found at the quarters after daybreak. Then the fears and labors of another day begin, and until its close there is no such thing as rest. He fears he will be caught lagging through the day. He fears to approach the gin house with his basket load of cotton at night. He fears when he lies down that he will oversleep himself in the morning. Such is a true, faithful, unexaggerated picture and description of the slave's daily life during the time of cotton picking on the shores of Bayou Boeuf. In the month of January, generally, the fourth and last picking is completed. Then commences the harvesting of corn. This is considered a secondary crop, and receives far less attention than the cotton. It is planted, as already mentioned, in February. Corn is grown in that region for the purpose of fattening hogs and feeding slaves, very little, if any, being sent to market. It is the white variety, the ear of great size, and the stalk growing to the height of 8, and oftentimes 10 feet. In August the leaves are stripped off, dried in the sun, bound in small bundles, and stored away as provender for the mules and oxen. After this, the slaves go through the field, turning down the ear, for the purpose of keeping the rains from penetrating to the grain. It is left in this condition until after cotton picking is over, whether earlier or later. Then the ears are separated from the stalks, and deposited in the corn crib with the husks on. Otherwise, stripped of the husks, the weevil would destroy it. The stalks are left standing in the field. The Carolina, or sweet, potato is also grown in that region to some extent. They are not fed, however, to hogs or cattle, and are considered but of small importance. They are preserved by placing them upon the surface of the ground with a slight covering of earth or corn stalks. There is not a cellar on Bayou Boeuf. The ground is so low it would fill with water. Potatoes are worth from 2 to 3 bits, or shillings a barrel. Corn, except where there is an unusual scarcity, can be purchased at the same rate. As soon as the cotton and corn crops are secured, the stalks are pulled up, thrown into piles, and burned. The ploughs are started at the same time, throwing up the beds again, preparatory to another planting. The soil, in the parishes of Rapides and Avoyelles, and throughout the whole country, as far as my observation extended, is of exceeding richness and fertility. It is a kind of marl, of a brown or reddish color. It does not require those invigorating composts necessary to more barren lands, and on the same field the same crop is grown for many successive years. Ploughing, planting, picking cotton gathering the corn, and pulling and burning stalks, occupies the whole of the 4 seasons of the year. Drawing and cutting wood, pressing cotton, fattening and killing hogs are but incidental labors. In the month of September or October, the hogs are run out of the swamps by dogs and confined in pens. On a cold morning, generally about New Year's Day, they are slaughtered. Each carcass is cut into 6 parts, and piled one above the other in salt, upon large tables in the smokehouse. In this condition it remains a fortnight, when it is hung up, and a fire built and continued more than half the time during the remainder of the year. This thorough smoking is necessary to prevent the bacon from becoming infested with worms. In so warm a climate, it is difficult to preserve it, and very many times myself and my companions have received our weekly allowance of 3 pounds and a half, when it was full of these disgusting vermin. Although the swamps are overrun with cattle, they are never made the source of profit to any considerable extent. The planter cuts his mark upon the ear, or brands his initials upon the side, and turns them into the swamps, to roam unrestricted within their almost limitless confines. They are the Spanish breed, small and spike-horned. I have known of droves being taken from Bayou Boeuf, but it is a very rare occurrence. The value of the best cows is about $5 each. 2 quarts at one milking would be considered an unusual large quantity. They furnish little tallow, and that of a soft inferior quality. Notwithstanding the great number of cows that throng the swamps, the planters are indebted to the North for their cheese and butter, which is purchased in the New Orleans market. Salted beef is not an article of food either in the great house or in the cabin. Master Epps was accustomed to attend shooting matches for the purpose of obtaining what fresh beef he required. These sports occurred weekly at the neighboring village of Holmesville. Fat beeves were driven thither and shot at, a stipulated price being demanded for the privilege. The lucky marksman divides the flesh among his fellows, and in this manner the attending planters are supplied. The great number of tame and untamed cattle which swarm the woods and swamps of Bayou Boeuf most probably suggested that appellation to the French, inasmuch as the term, translated, signifies the creek or river of the wild ox. Garden products, such as cabbages, turnips, and the like, are cultivated for the use of the master and his family. They have greens and vegetables at all times and seasons of the year. The grass withereth and the flower fadeth before the desolating winds of autumn in the chill northern latitudes, but perpetual verdure overspreads the hot lowlands, and flowers bloom in the heart of winter in the region of Bayou Boeuf. There are no meadows appropriated to the cultivation of the grasses. The leaves of the corn supply a sufficiency of food for the laboring cattle, while the rest provide for themselves all the year in the ever-growing pasture. There are many other peculiarities of climate, habit, custom, and of the manner of living and laboring at the South, but the foregoing, it is supposed, will give the reader an insight and general idea of life on a cotton plantation in Louisiana. The mode of cultivating cane, and the process of sugar manufacturing will be mentioned in another place. End of chapter 12.